First of all, welcome. This is our third session on this book. What is called Thinking by Heidegger. We're reading lectures 9 and 10 of the first part this time. And before we get going on everybody's reactions and everything, I just want to lay out a next section. We're going to read the first 5 lectures of part 2. That takes us through a whole bunch of intro material on the different meanings of the title, of what is called thinking, and the calling part of that, and some discussion of logic and logos before introducing the kind of big saying that we're going to be interpreting in the rest of part 2, which is the saying of Parmenides that being and thinking are the same, which comes at the very end of lecture 5. So basically, we're gonna go up until we see Parmenides come over the horizon, right? We're going to get through all that part in one session. There's 11 sections rather than 10 in the second part, so this is taking us through the first 5 of those. We'll leave room for 2 smaller sessions to more concentrate on the Parmenides parts next time. So anyway, the point is that reading for next time will be around 60 pages, and it will be lectures 1 to 5 of part 2. Time-wise, I'm thinking of August the 20th, Sunday, August the 20th, if that works for people. If anyone has a problem with that time, let me know, but that's what I'm thinking will give us enough time to read 5 sections. Any issues with that, with either of those? Okay, wanted to get that out of the way early. We can come back to it at the end and give a little sketch of what's going to be there in that first part of part 2. But okay, so with that, welcome everybody. For anyone who's new and doesn't know the format, we basically usually go around the table first and have people talk about their first impressions of the reading, including did they manage to do the reading, had they read this before, things they want to make sure we hit on in the discussion, or that raised issues for them, and everybody get a first reaction to that. Then we'll do a little bit of expository stuff for me, but mostly and answering questions, and also just trying to go through what we had in the material of the reading. And then some questions about all at the end, and let people come back and ask detailed textual questions of the specific thing that hasn't come up yet. And then toward the end, sketch out a little bit what we're going to do next. That's typically what we do in a session. All of these do get recorded and get put up on YouTube, my YouTube channel, just my name. And there'll be links to that at the end of the event after I get a chance to put it up. Anyway, that's my administrivia. And with that said, we can start on actual first reactions. Craig, you want to start us off?
Okay, I did read the material. Wasn't quite as obtuse as Heidegger often is. Seemed to be fairly straightforward. Got through it. First impression, it left me with what he's still setting us up by talking about where Nietzsche went and what Nietzsche got to, but he's not agreeing to it yet. So we got further explorations to do, but seemed to be more straightforward than some of the stuff we've gone through with him in the past. And but it was much more about Nietzsche and what he was saying, Nietzsche was saying, less about what he himself was ready to say yet. So that was my first impression.
Okay. Do you think he had a punchline about Nietzsche? Because he's actually going to kind of drop Nietzsche after this, for at least for a bit. So do you think he got to a point or reached a conclusion about his assessment or interpretation of Nietzsche?
Well, the issue, we'll talk about it probably in more detail. The eternal recurrence was the issue that he seemed to drop in there, and as an evolutionist, I have trouble with that concept. But it was the place in which he made the transition to Superman and seemed to be pushing that this is what Nietzsche, and this was the resolution Nietzsche got to.
Okay, I mean, we'll come back to it, but I mean, to me, he's made a lot of claims before this section, and he's now got to deliver on a bunch of them, and the delivery has to be something like showing that Nietzsche is at bottom an example of metaphysics, that he fits into a metaphysical schema, and to do that, he's got to give an interpretation which shows that these various things going on in Nietzsche that might seem disjoint or disconnected from one another, or might not seem to be about metaphysics at all, actually are organized and unified by a single metaphysical thesis, and a single interpretation, ties them all together and shows how one implies the other and vice versa. And that's sort of what he's got to do in these two lectures to sort of make the point that he was trying to make at he left hanging at the end of 8, where he said, let us see whether or not revenge has anything to do with metaphysics. Let us learn thinking, right? So this is meant to be an example of the thinking that the whole book is supposed to be about, and we have to assess for ourselves whether or not he's proven it, or he's shown what he was trying to show. But anyway, it's fine for first impressions. Well, I like the fact you found it was straightforward, but if something is straightforward, you should be able to sum up its takeaway. That's what I was just stressing you to do. Dan, do you want to react to that before I go into Dan?
No, I think that was okay. It was a good place to go. At least I have a better understanding of revenge getting through the words. So that was helpful, and we'll see how far we got and see what my understanding leads to.
Okay, yeah, we'll get there. Dan, first impressions.
So yeah, I read the 2 chapters this morning and yesterday morning, and I really like them. And I think since you ask if he's delivering, I think he is. And I like how he brings everything, like connects it with being as presence from ancient Greeks, and then he brings in all the history of metaphysics, and that's like how Aristotle defined time, and that kind of was the main point that still is present today, and how around that everything evolves, and being as presence, and how the two, being and time, are linked together, and how Nietzsche took on this with, who is it, like try to stamp the becoming with the stamp of being, with this eternal recurrence of the same, and revenge, and so on. So yeah, I really like it. I like the 2 chapters a lot, and I think they are quite deep, and I think there were 2 or 3 moments when he brought up like thinking, like deep thinking, what it means to think, and give this is what it means to think, to go deep into this kind of issues and stay with them and see what's there, despite the parents that nothing is there, and actually there is a lot there, and this is what we are doing here, trying to think. So yeah, I like it, and I think there's a lot of material out there.
Fair. It's probably a lot. We'll get to it more when we get to the substance, but Finder, first impression. Pete.
Yes, so I read it, and I also read a bunch of lectures Heidegger gave in the late 30s on the eternal recurrence of the same. And there he goes through everything Nietzsche wrote about recurrence systematically. It's kind of uncharacteristic for Heidegger to just follow somebody else's text so closely. And one thing you get out of it is the Nietzsche's thinking about the eternal recurrence of the same is kind of a mess. There's some early stuff in the gay science, then Zarathustra is the big one, but that one's fiction, it's told as a story. And then there's some stuff towards the end. And then by this point, they published Nietzsche's notes, whatever was in the archive. And there's all kinds of fragments on the eternal recurrence of the same. So I kind of think I know what Nietzsche means by the circle there and stuff. How the analogies are supposed to work and stuff. I'm surprised Heidegger spent so much time on Nietzsche, honestly, especially by 52. One thing that struck me this time, how much it is like reading the pre-Socratics. in terms of its fragmentary nature of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche never wrote a textbook. All his stuff is very impressionistic. So it's hard to pin him down like Aristotle or Kant as to this is what they meant to say. And I was struck also by how much of it seems to be self-help philosophy versus the textbook stuff like doing metaphysics. How much of it is being the last man to become the overman who can cross the bridge. And the reason to do it is to get past resentment and revenge. And this is all, to my mind, very psychological and about the individual in the way Heidegger is not. Or, you know, obviously Heidegger has his reasons to go, you know, pursue Nietzsche down this path. So I guess enough about first impressions.
I mean, I think there are places where Heidegger's got some of those things. I'm thinking of early Heidegger and Being in Time particularly has a psychological aspect. And then also part of the thesis here is that the places in Nietzsche that seem so psychological are more metaphysical than they appear at first glance. I'll mention a few other cases, places where these things connect. He makes the point here, though, that there's an underlying thesis where Nietzsche has accepted from people like Schopenhauer and the German idealistic tradition in general, going back to Leibniz, that the primal being is will, right? And that's the place where these two things wind up connecting. Things which you might think are psychological can be metaphysical if you're committed to the thesis that primary being is will, and vice versa. Yeah, so it's fair to say there's a lot that it appears, I can put it this way, appears merely psychological in Nietzsche, but is not. It is psychological, but not without the merely. This is also true of other traditions in, I would put it this way, religious thought. There's elements here of things which are you can find in Kierkegaard or in Augustine. So this tendency of some of the thinkers in this area, if not this school, to blend the psychological, the self-helpy narrative and the metaphysical is, you're right to point that out, that that's an aspect of Nietzsche, but it's not an aspect of just Nietzsche. It's part of the tradition he's in. But yes.
Yeah, and so I get what Heidegger sees in the ontological respect, and because, you know, Nietzsche is using the eternal recurrence of the same to overcome the will to power, because everything is will to power. The Greeks were will to power, the Christians are will to power, just in different ways. And Nietzsche is then using the eternal recurrence of the same to overcome will to power and its consequences. And Heidegger sees the analogy that the different wills to power are different plural ontologies, like the Christian or the modern. And Heidegger thinks, you know, we get beyond plural ontologies by looking at a rightness directly, or looking at the clearing, to keep it short. And so, you know, Nietzsche overcomes will to power with eternal recurrence of the same, and Heidegger overcomes plural ontologies with a rightness. And so that's, I think, what's attractive to Heidegger, not the personal psychology stuff, not the phenomenology.
I think those two are more connected than you might think, but we'll get to it. Isabel.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hold on a second.
Sure.
Oh, there I am. I'm in Truro, Massachusetts with all my grandchildren, so I may just leave. I'm so sorry. But yes, I did all the reading. I did it early on. I liked it quite a lot. And not that I understood it, with question marks. And I thought I would ask you about that. The points I didn't understand. And I have enormous difficulty not being of philosophical background, not knowing Nietzsche or many of the other philosophers. But I am able, because Heidegger is so very clear in his obtuse way, if I can say that, that I can more or less understand what he's trying to say about Nietzsche. And just a little parenthesis, I thought that it's not the eternal recurrence of the same was not so much the will to power, but his revenge against time. But again, Pete has done all the readings in the background readings, but I'm just trying to see what I can garnish from what I have. My difficulty is, for instance, when he uses the term will, and it turns out to be a primal being. I can't see that, because in my experience, when I learned about will, and speaking of St. John of the Cross, one of the mystics in the La Noche Oscura, the will is a faculty of the soul. The will is a faculty of the soul. The other faculties are memory and intellect. And those are the things that have to be quieted down, estando ya mi casa sosegada, so that my house is now quiet, so that I can then go out and then be free. But I have to quiet those. So it's difficult for me to see these different
I understand the tradition you're coming from, and the role that will has there. In the modern German idealists, the will they're talking about is not just the individual will of the single person. They're talking about will as something which exists across people. The prior structure of will in the world, that there is will in the world. What all the wills have in common as will, what makes them will. Some of the older traditions had a will of a world soul or a will of God. So will is not simply the individual human will. In sometimes it is presented as this differentiated thing. In Leibniz, monads are individual wills. That's why it's a plural after them. But they're also microcosms, because they're images of the structure of the whole to Leibniz. And in the later German idealists, you get something like the notion of the beings themselves are the thoughts of God, and that means that there's something mind-like and mind-like behind what is, and the mind-like that is behind what is can also be thought of as having will. And if we have wills, it's because we share in that. So that the human will, the psychological will, is seen as a reflection or participation in a principle of life itself, or a principle of will itself. So that's what you get even in the earlier German idealists. Nietzsche's immediate teacher was Schopenhauer, and his most famous book is called The World as Will and as Representation, where he presents there as being sort of two fundamental ways of viewing or understanding what is. One is as just a representation or mental picture in a kind of Cartesian manner that views it as something external outside the mind, of which we just have an image or picture in a kind of causal network or something. But the other is as will, as life or drive, in which all of that representation picture is seen as a motivated function of the consciousness. So something like will is seen as being more fundamental than the images of the world that the will merely uses through representation in someone like Schopenhauer. And that's Nietzsche's immediate philosophical teacher. He's reacting against some of the pessimism you find in Schopenhauer, but his understanding of will or life as being a more fundamental thing than than something like external objects. We can put it that way. That you find that in Nietzsche. There's a place, I think it's in Young and Evil, where he tries to explain the idea by saying the world viewed from inside would be will to power specifically and nothing else. So the attempt to view the world from the inside is what Nietzsche is about here. And the question is the world as it is viewed from the inside the real world? Nietzsche is committed to the proposition that the attempt to distinguish between the world as viewed from the inside is a merely apparent world from the real world, which is behind that is Platonism, that's a kind of alien philosophy he's reacting to, and that the apparent world is the world we actually live in, something like that. But I understand when you cross philosophical traditions that treat these terms differently, it can be very difficult to see the translation of it. Schelling, when he says will is primal being, is thinking primarily of a way more than individual personal will, more like a principle of all life, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. I gathered that it was something beyond the concept of will that I am used to.
Yep.
And one thing about my reading of Heidegger, though, I did the reading very early on, and then I picked it up before this session, and it's amazing that it seems to me as I read again, I say to myself, did I read this? I didn't read this part. It goes to show how fertile he is in his exposition.
Yeah, you can find something new every time. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and one final thing, one good thing about recording is that I can go ahead and not only re-listen to your points, which are not that easy to understand at first glance, but I can also see that what I have said. And one of the things that I said about Pirandello, whoever remembers, is that his play Vestire Nudi, Clothe the Naked, is a short story. No, it is not. I never read it, but I did read it. It is a very long 3-act play.
Okay.
Beautiful, beautiful play. Just wanted to correct that. Okay, and I'm eager to see what will transpire. As if you see me disappear, you'll know why.
Okay, thanks. Great. Joe, you want to give us your first impressions?
Yes, I have to say that because of the duration, 6 weeks between our sessions, I had a chance to read the chapter twice and maybe even part of a third time. She's correct. Each time I read it, it's almost as if I was reading it for the first time. But the point is, two things sort of puzzle me. In the first place, I interpreted will not in a volitional human choice type of way. I thought maybe he's talking about the will to life, which you observe even when you see an occasional green sprout coming out of what you thought was a dead tree stump. You know, there's still life in there, and it's showing a little green sprout. This will to life thing is something I can appreciate as being one of the most powerful things that we've ever found regarding anything biological, at least. So that's impressive. But the thing that I really wanted to explore today, and I can do mostly by listening, is why did he choose the word revenge when he appears to be only regretting the fact that time moves and has something what formerly was? You know, so he seems to be saying, gee whiz, how come we have the eternal recurrence of the same instead of having a nice static universe? Something here doesn't get to me. And I appreciate that he's trying to fish between a connection between a label, revenge, which might just be an inadequate label, and some metaphysical deep thing, which I apparently have not really caught hold of yet. So I'm eager to find out more what you have to say about Nietzsche, and I'm probably more eager to go ahead and read part 2 of the Heidegger book.
Gotcha. So, I mean, we'll definitely get to why he calls, he basically says, this alone is revenge, the will's revulsion against time, and it was. So he's trying to define what he means by revenge, and there's something about, well, why does he pick that word? There's something about the will which is not reconciled to time. There's something at will which is at war with time, is the claim. You can think of this as Nietzsche's understanding of the rage against the dying of the light, if you like, right? A non-acceptance of human finitude or mortality, a non-acceptance of the transitoriness of existence. The will to life wills for eternity. It wills for lastingness. It doesn't want to go out. And to the extent that there is in that not just a love of future, but a dislike of the conditions in which it finds itself, there is the danger of resentment against existence itself stemming from that. So there's a in Kierkegaard where he's talking about what is despair, right? The non-despair is something like in relating to oneself and in wanting to be oneself, to be grounded transparently in the power that establishes, something like that. The important part there is the wanting to be itself, right? Does the will want to be what it is? Does it want to be something that it is not? Is it not reconciled to what it is? In the earlier German idealists, people like Fichte, you find the notion of being as what resists the will, the thing which you can just wish otherwise, you regard as internal, interior to your consciousness or interior to yourself, something you can make different by just imagining it different, you recognize as you, and something you cannot make different just by imagining it different, you recognize as not you, as something which resists your will and is not simply subservient to your will or reacting to your will. You may learn enough about the world to be able to intervene in the world with power in ways that extend the boundaries of you and reduce the boundaries of what resists you. That's one interpretation of what the will to power is. It's this desire of the will to transcend whatever limits it, or to incorporate whatever limits it, and to subject what is to its will, right? But that means that to begin with, the unconquered is how being first appears to the will, the what resists. So these are ways in which something like a resentment, frustration, or something with which the will is not reconciled can be found in the structure of willing itself, something like that. Another way to think about this is the will is all about trying to change what is by deliberate acts. That implies a dissatisfaction with what currently is, right? There's a restlessness to will. Will is something like a restlessness of life that is not simply reconciled to where and as things are now. All of that's just general things about how you could tie up primal will with something like revenge or resentment. The other thing you find in Nietzsche specifically here is he's focusing on the it was, on the past, the fact that the will cannot will backwards. Why would the will be upset by the fact that it cannot will backwards? It cannot conquer the past. It cannot change where it came from. It cannot change what made it what it is, right? It is thrown into the world. It is thrown into the nature of its life. It does not have the life that it made or that it chose. It has the life that befell it. And that is, again, something that can be reacted to with the spirit of identification with what you are, or with a spirit of resentment on those limitations as not being your own. They were not your creation. So some people, some psychology may experience not even self-overcoming, but resentment of one's own past, something like that. Besides resentment of one's own past, there's also resentment of the past in general, right? So anyway, we'll get to the various nuances of what Nietzsche thinks of as the spirit of revenge, but I'm just pointing out the various ways in which the psychology of will and even the structure of will itself might imply something like dissatisfaction or disquiet. Now, Nietzsche thinks the spirit of revenge is something which can be overcome. It's not necessary that will itself always have revenge in it or resentment in it, but he does think that there is a spirit of revenge in most human thought hitherto. and we'll talk about, how deep Nietzsche thinks that goes various ways later. But you also could say that there's a lot of other traditions that see something like being reconciled to being grateful, being at peace with one's limitation in the universe, something like that, as being a formula for enlightenment. You find this in even Quietists and Buddhists and various other kinds of physics. There's an element of that here too. Nietzsche speaks of the result of the doctrine of eternal return as the same as being amor fati, love of fate, as being reconciliation to fate. So I'm just sketching out the ways in which all these things may be connected. We'll go through how Heidegger thinks they are connected in Nietzsche, but the whole terrain, there's in willing itself, there's philosophical reasons to see there being something like a restlessness in will itself. James, readings, first impression.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I read the 2 chapters. They're really deep thoughts, about everything. The will. So for Nietzsche, this kind of spirit of revenge, this express or kind of represents his irreconcilability with the will. So the will for him becomes a kind of a will that wills against itself. At the same time, it's willing for itself. And I get the impression that the way Heidegger is interpreting that is that this revenge leads him to a kind of metaphysics, because that's a way to free himself from this spirit of revenge, and to reconcile this conflict. So that's what that's how he tries to resolve that problem, that kind of conflict. But I'm not sure. So that's why there's some questions about that. And so there's a discussion about time, that the being, the will, is a kind of the primal being, or the primal will is what Heidegger refers to as a relationship with being, and that being is for being to be reconciled, with itself. Like I think he's recommending that it could be separate from time, instead of being in conflict with this, what has been past and so forth, with time that passes. There's a suggestion that if you you take time in terms of just the present and accept that kind of presence as being, then does that reconcile this kind of conflict? So yeah, I think that's what Heidegger is saying, that this this eternal recurrence of the same is this kind of metaphysics that is traditionally considered metaphysics, that Heidegger is critical of, right? So yeah, that's how I interpret what I've read.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
mean, there are aspects of metaphysics that he is critical of, and there are aspects of metaphysics which he sees as also being a deep and important thing in history of Western thought, something like that. It has both those moments to it. On the time stuff, we'll get to it in significantly greater detail, but there's a first point, which is that in being as opposed to becoming, as you find that even in Nietzsche, who's supposed to be a philosopher of becoming and interested in moving towards becoming and away from being, you still see him calling it the peak of the meditation, the eternal return, saying because it is the closest approximation to a world of being that is possible within a world of becoming. So he can only believe in a world of becoming but he wants a world of becoming that approximates as closely as possible to a world of being. And what he means by a world of being is something like a world of eternity. The being that he's trying to approximate more by eternal return of the same than becoming without it, or chaos, is an ordered eternity, something like that. So the accent of eternity still is there for what counts as being to Nietzsche. The being and the eternal are still correlated for him. And then Heidegger himself is pointing out, though, that the primitive sense of being that Heidegger detects is operating in this thinking is that the being present, which is only one of the modes of time and leaves out the past and the future for the present, that being as presence seems to be controlling the interpretation of time in metaphysics generally, including in Nietzsche. So time is entering in two ways. Time is entering as something to be overcome in order to achieve eternity, and time is entering as something only whose present moment of which is seen as having full being. So in one sense, full being is only what is present, and in some sense, full being is only what is eternal. And the full structure of time, as you would experience it phenomenologically, is not present in either. So this is part of what Heidegger is getting in talking about metaphysical structures and where time enters into them. There's a question of, is our understanding of being founded on an understanding of time, or the other way around, or do you get a circle and a knot between them of a notion of time being used to understand being, and then that notion of being used to understand time, with the time being a different time than the first one. So this is the sort of characteristic thing that Heidegger thinks he's detecting in the tradition of understandings of being, that being is a time word, and how the different philosophies deal with that is revealing about their own structure, whether or not they are phenomenally rich about that, whether or not they're grounding themselves in how time actually is and appears, or whether or not it's theses about escaping time, if I can put it this way, that are driving some of the anxiety of their metaphysics, if I can put it that way, right? So if there's an element in revenge as a spirit, which is a dislike of something about time, then something about the relationship of any revengeful thing, spirit consciousness, to being is involved in how the temporal aspect of being is understood, right? So partly this is just sketching out that Heidegger is making the claim that the problematic he uncovered in Being and Time, or talks about in the later stages of Basic Problems of Phenomenology, is a core knot at the basis of metaphysics, back to Aristotle, but forward to Nietzsche, and that they all have the same knot in them, more or less. The other part of it is the ways in which there is, if I can put it this way, evasion of this or that aspect of the temporality of existence in any given philosophy is revealing of what Heidegger likes to call the unthought matter in that philosophy. You can think of him as psychoanalyzing the different philosophers and finding out where they have a complex related to their unresolved issues with time. I'm exaggerating for clarity in a way that like a Derrida would. But that's part of what's going on here. I don't know if that helps, James.
Yeah, right. That does. Yeah. So he this kind of thought. He gave examples of mysticism and.
Sorry, what's the word?
Yeah, mysticism and what's.
Oh, mysticism. Yes.
And what's the other one? This maybe like what Nietzsche is doing. The resort to eternal recurrence thing, where it kind of.
yeah, I don't know if resort to it is the right word, but I mean, he definitely, Nietzsche has a metaphysical view and metaphysical interpretation of what primal being is, how it is, what truth is, how man is related to each of these things, what man's essential nature is. And Heidegger is basically trying to show that all of those things in their interrelation with one another are founded upon a set of theses about what being is and about how time is and how all these things are related to time, that is an unthought matter, meaning it is not the explicit forefront of consciousness in what these thinkers are tackling, but it is still determining much of what they do. But again, some of this stuff can wait until we get into the actual substance. Background point, Nietzsche presents himself as reacting to a resentment that he detects in the previous history of Western philosophical tradition, which he sees as culminating in nihilism. And the nature of that nihilism is that there was something world denying about previous philosophy. There was something about previous philosophy that denigrated the apparent world, denigrated the world we actually live in favor of an ideal projected behind it, which was an unreal standard used to judge and condemn the world. And that Nietzsche's characteristic debunking sort of philosophical move is to reverse that from a diagnosis to a motivation, and to say, because these philosophers were not reconciled to existence as such, because there was something pessimistic in them, because there was something resentful in them, therefore they had to come up with a structural explanation of the world such that the world we actually live in could be blamed for those faults, right? They were unreconciled with the world as it is, something like that. So there's something in just the attempt to, not even the attempt to, the desire to live in a world that is not the world we actually live in, that is a sign of resentment of man's condition, something like that. So that sort of detecting an unreconciled resentment in previous thought is a move that Nietzsche himself makes on people like Plato, people like Christianity, or movements like Christianity, right? And if you don't know that about him, it's hard to see why he's bringing in this resentment thing here, right? He detects resentment in Plato putting the ideal world behind the real world. He detects resentment in Augustine wanting to live in eternity because he doesn't want to live in Augustine's life here and now, right? He detects resentment in asceticism. He detects resentment in Schopenhauer's fundamental belief that the will is actively evil because of its self-preference, and that only the quieting of the will would be reconcilable with justice because the will itself is unjust. All of those are world-denying views to Nietzsche. And he's detecting resentment in them. He's detecting a desire to be revenged upon reality in them. I don't know if that helps.
And Heidegger,
Sorry, you're muffled.
and Heidegger is saying that he detects this resentment in Nietzsche himself with this revulsion at this time.
Somewhat true. I mean, he makes the argument that revenge is always tied to that. Even the desire to be delivered from the spirit of revenge is tied to the spirit of revenge, something like that. You can ask whether or not Nietzsche arrives at gratitude by an overwhelming sense of the wonderfulness of the world, or he arrives at gratitude out of furious, resentful denunciation of the spirit of resentment. And does he arrive at gratitude? Right? It may be doubted if you've read his last 3 or 4 books. Right? So this is something which Heidegger alludes to along the way, but he's also trying to be fair to Nietzsche's thesis. That is, he's trying to explain Nietzsche's thesis itself, as well as pointing out the ways in which Nietzsche might not completely get there. At other places, Heidegger will say that the nihilism cannot be overcome because overcoming is inherently nihilistic, or you can't resent resentment out of your way out of resentment, right? I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Bruce.
Yeah, I haven't read the book. I've got it. I've got the paperback. Just so many other things right now, but I do want to kind of listen and get some insight into Heidegger's thinking and into Nietzsche, and so I'm just going to be in the background for the moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. So your friend on the phone, what's first name? I don't have it because it's just the phone number.
Hi, I'm Philip.
Philip.
Philip, okay.
Yeah,
Philip.
hi. I also have not done the reading, although I actually think I did read this book maybe 30 years ago, but I've read a lot of Heidegger, and so I won't comment on this particular book, but I do have a question based on what was said so far, and I want to draw together two parts of the German idealist tradition and then ask how Heidegger would respond to that. So we've established that the will is not just my will in German idealism, it's something broader. You can find that in Schopenhauer and Schelling and many others. And we've also looked at the idea that the world is that which resists my will, right? And I'm wondering how to bring these two together. Like, for example, if I want to disassemble a bridge, let's say, well, that resists my will. I can't do that myself. But my society could, right? My society could decide to, well, we're going to tear down that bridge. And then, you know, to give one further example, my society couldn't decide that from now on there's going to be 2 moons in the sky, right? So obviously the will of the society has limitations too. So I mean, if we bring these two things together, and if it looks like, because it sort of suggests then that from my limited point of view, that bridge is world. It resists my will. But from the society's point of view, there's a certain, you know, tricky sense in which that bridge isn't world. It's part of will. Like we can tear it down if we want to. And so far I've only talked about the German idealists, but I'm wondering how this...
Too much too fast, right? So first of all, a couple points. It's not world that resists will, it's being, right? Being is not simply equal to world. World includes being and self in the German idealist tradition, right? And consciousness and whatever. The position of the German idealists like Fichte and to a lesser degree Hegel is that being is a sense ascribed to things that resist will, but that's not what the word world means. First, just keep world separate. And second, when you get to people like Hegel, who is a idealist and rationalist, meaning by rationalist I mean he thinks that you can reason out what actually has to be from first principles, something like that, not just empirically. There is a notion that the ascription of being to external things as seeing them as being not part of consciousness is only a preliminary stage, an alienated stage that will be replaced by a full understanding of those things as being what they are to the consciousness when the consciousness fully comprehends them. And in that sense, the bridge that actually exists is the bridge that is correctly understood by all the people who correctly understand the bridge, and that is the bridge. And the full understanding of what is that way, it's destroys the alienation of seeing that thing as not part of the consciousness, not simply by achieving power over it, but by incorporating into what the consciousness itself is, not simply an imagination and willing, but an understanding of truth, of what actually is and is true. If the will has educated itself to conform to truth, it has reconciled itself to what is, not simply by viewing that as something alien that it is accepted, but as recognizing itself in its representation / image of that thing. this is Hegel rather than, you get a little bit of precursors of it in Fish, The Science of Knowledge, but that's the full version of that with the whole alienation angle is definitely what you get in Hegel, right? So the does that mean that the what the society can or can't do with things? In Hegel, what the society can or can't do in things, if it has a vertical understanding of them, is pretty much what's determining what is. From Hegel's point of view, a fully rational and fully informed society would be living in a real world that it would no longer view as exterior to human consciousness, human not being individual consciousness, but the full understanding of whatever all the sciences knew, etc. But they would be living in that as the real world, even though that thing that they were living in would be a world, not simply a being. World being understood as includes all of our understanding and consciousness of it, is a Kantian-like projection of how the mind understands things. Because he's an idealist, in the last analysis, Hegel thinks we are living in a constructed world. When I say constructed, I mean constructed by consciousness, not just ours, but everyone's. I don't know if that helps, but I wanted to get all that untangled a little bit before we wanted to go further. It's a reasonable line of thought, but if we throw in terms like world and being and conflate the two, we're going to get tied up in knots.
Yes, and I was avoiding the word being. I was trying to use the word world in the least theory-laden way possible. So let me try to be even less theory-laden.
Sure.
So let me get to my Heidegger question. So Heidegger at this stage in his career is downplaying the role of the individual, let's say. And, you know, there's various political reasons for doing that, but I'm wondering if there's an ontological reason for it too, in the sense that within the German philosophical tradition, and again, I'm gonna try to find really terms that are not theory-laden at all. So if we think of the individual not being able to tear down the bridge, there's a resistance there to me as an individual. But as a member of the society, all of a sudden there is the capacity to tear down the bridge. So that which resists my will there's a lot of it when it's just me as an individual. But when it's me as part of a community, all of a sudden there's less that resists my will. There's all sorts of things like the bridge that no longer resist my will if my will is part of the communal will. And I'm wondering if this relates to Heidegger's later downplaying of the role of the individual, which he did for political reasons, but I think he also did for philosophical reasons. And that's my question. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the power that the whole society has over what is, late Heidegger understands in terms of how he understands technology and the way in which the beings appear to the understanding of being that is present in technology, which is that they appear as standing reserve, as orderable energy, as though everything is subject to the reordering will of the technological drive, if we can put it that way. He's not particularly impressed by how communal that is. He is particularly impressed by how this has two consequences. One is that their being itself disappears, replaced by the projects of the will. And the second is that the man in the midst of that relationship ceases to be the understander of being and becomes a mere means for the ordering of what is, and is reduced to standing reserve himself. So that's how I think the later Heidegger understands that connection, of that set of connections. It's his kind of critique of the Nietzschean world he sees us in, which is in a way a successor to the Hegelian world from Heidegger's point of view, which has lost even the element of rationality as limiting of the will that was there in Hegel, and has replaced it with something like a more autonomous will to power. I don't know if that helps, but the last thing Heidegger is enamored of is being conquered to the point of disappearing. He thinks if being is conquered to the point of disappearing because there is nothing resisting human project anymore, then man has lost his relation to truth. and he's living in a fiction that he's writing. But the fiction that he's writing is going to do a lot of the writing without a lot of his input.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to wait until the next, I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to wait until the next session when I will have done the reading. And yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I agree that because the talk about will was throwing me off here, because I think of, for Heidegger, that it's sort of a receptivity to being on the part of the community that's the primary emphasis. So I was struck by how so far we've talked about the will of the community. Now, granted, we only talked about that in the German idealist tradition. We didn't talk about that in Heidegger himself. But yeah, I'll wait till I've actually done the reading. And thank you very much. Your answer was really helpful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sure.
I mean, not bye, but
Yeah, I got it. Okay. All right. So I want to just give people a chance to ask if there are things that they want to make sure that we cover that confuse them or puzzle them. I have my own stuff I want to get through in 9 and 10. We've raised a number of things up to this point, but were there particular concepts, passages that were unclear to you that you want us to address first before I go all expository on you? Or hands up if you have a particular thing you want to make sure you cover or that was unclear to you. James.
Yeah, that line down from Hegel, at the bottom of page 89, where he says, better a
Torn
minute,
sock.
yeah, better minutes sock than a torn one. Not so with self-consciousness.
Yes.
So it sounds like it means that in order to understand and on a higher level, you have to be open, right? Your consciousness has to be open somehow, torn or wounded or something like that.
Ripped. Yes.
Ripped.
Ripped or torn. So this is in the context of a real relatedness to being. Heidegger has just said, when thinking plies its proper trade, which is to rip away the fog that conceals being as such, it must be concerned not to cover up the rift. He's not entirely explicit about what the rift is there, but he's thinking of something like a rift between man and being. And then when he's quoting the Hegel, he's putting it in brackets of he's only talking about a particular view in his own metaphysics, not the same thing I'm talking about, but he still says the same thing. Better torn self-consciousness than mended self-consciousness. What's the point of that? The point of that is that it is the learning enters only when there is something out of joint with how consciousness is understanding the world. This is the labor of the negative in Hegelian terms. It's the contradictions that you find in your previous attempts to understand that drive you to the next stage of the dialectic, anything like that. So a mended consciousness that is satisfied that it has answered everything is a consciousness which has stopped learning and cannot learn. That's the common point there that Heidegger is appealing to. Through the rift, torn consciousness is open to the absolute. This also holds true for thinking. The torn condition keeps open the way. He says into metaphysics, and there metaphysics is not being used as a term denoting something which he thinks of as errancy or a mistake, but the subject matter itself, that we can think about it. I want to go through some things that are earlier on that page, but I don't know if that helped with the mended sock.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it sounds like something from Hamlet. Hamlet, how the world is pointed.
Sorry, you're getting a little muffled occasionally. It's hard.
Yeah,
hard to
and
follow.
that's in Hamlet, he says something about the world being disjointed, but that's
Well,
also
without a joint. Yes.
yeah. That's also how he progresses in his self-consciousness, right?
In Hamlet and Hegel, yes. I want to direct attention to the thing earlier on this page where he says, when it comes to saving man's essential nature, psychology, whether such one form of psychotherapy, is helpless. Ethics as mere doctrine imperative is helpless. unless man first comes to have a different fundamental relation to being, unless man of his own accord, so far as in him lies, begins at last to hold his nature open for once to the essential relation toward being, the sentence keeps going, right? It's a very involved sentence, right? What's going on here is definitely Heidegger putting out a view of his own, not a view he's describing to Nietzsche. And he's making a claim about the limitation of psychology and ethics compared to essential relation to being. And I also want to point out a couple of words there. Begins at last to hold home his nature for once. I want to point out the at last and for once. Why does this matter? Because he says it's an essential relation to being, but then it has an at last and an at once. Now we have to be a little bit Platonic and naive here for a second and recognize that an essential relation shouldn't change. If a relation is essential, it's because it's not accidental. That's the definition of essential, right? The opposite of an essential relation is an accidental relation. An essential relation has to be that way, and an accidental relation doesn't have to be that way. So if it has to be that way, why is it subject to an at last and a for once? He's saying that there's, for a long time since, there's been some essential relation of man to being which hasn't been open to being, so that it would be an at last if it happened, and a for once as though there's lots of occasions for it to occur, but it never does. So you get this at last and an at once, both referring to what is supposedly an essential relation. So we have the idea of an essential relation that can change. And you have to recognize that an essential relation that can change is a controversial thing to say, right? At least from the standpoint of traditional understandings of essence and time. Go ahead, Pete.
Well, maybe, well, our understanding changes, but maybe it was an error before.
Absolutely.
So we thought we had the essential, but we missed it, and now we have the essential.
It would be easy to instead here say something like man comes to understand his essential relation to being, right? Then you'd have an unchanging essence, and the thing that it would be subject to change is man's understanding of it, but he doesn't.
Assuming an unchanging essence is metaphysics, isn't it?
This is exactly my point, right? He is by his at last and at once forcing you to consider essential relations that change. He is denying that essentiality and means or implies constancy through time, when that is in the tradition what the word means.
Right. So in Platonism, the forms are eternal.
Even in Aristotle, this use of S and X is Aristotle too, right?
Yes.
So it's not just Platonism, right? It's the tradition. Tradition as such treats essential versus accidental as what cannot change and what does change. And he wants there to be essential things that change. This is important to notice this, right? And why? Because what is at stake in this when it comes to saving man's essential nature? So this is a claim that there is something about man's essential nature which is essential. In which sense? The old sense or the new sense? But essential nature that is subject to a need of saving. This is to quote Nietzsche, a clattering of kettle drums and a pleading and preaching of repentance. We're going to be told how man can reach saving. Man can be saved, but can only be saved by saving man's essential nature can only be changed by a changed essential relation to being, which means there's an essential nature, there's an essential relation to being. The essential relation to being has to change to save man's essential nature. Now he'll go on to say that this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for such saving. That it's possible that thinking can do all that it can there to hold itself open to being as far as it can, and man's essential nature to still not be saved. Being might not respond to our overtures, so to speak, or may not speak to us. But what thinking can do is hold open the relation to being as far as it in man lies to do so, and this makes the possibility, but not the certainty or the actuality, of a saving of man's essential nature. Okay. Why does this matter? This is very early in our reading, and before he gets to anything like what Nietzsche regards as a deliverance from the spirit of revenge as a saving, he's telling you his own version of a saving. He's not spelling it all out, but he is leaving a place for the thing which is a parallel to what's going to be discussed as anything like a saving essential nature. For Nietzsche, saving essential nature is deliverance from the spirit of revenge. Here, we're going to have a saving essential nature, which is something more like man holding himself open to being as far as he can. And Nietzsche is going to regard the former as sufficient, and Heidegger is going to regard it as necessary but not sufficient. It's only one side of a two-sided relation. Okay. So why does this matter? One could think that because this chapter is not chapter, these two chapters, this section is claiming that this talk about revenge is actually about metaphysics and metaphysical doctrines. It's just about doctrines, and it doesn't have anything to do with ethics or psychology. But if you're saving man's essential nature, you're doing something that you claim is deeper than ethics and psychology, and upon which ethics and psychology depend. All right. This is the traditional sphere of something like religion. This needs to be pointed out. Doctrines of salvation by a different fundamental relationship to being are salvation narratives about a different fundamental relation to God. That is the parallel here, right? And the claim that something like a psychology or something like an ethics are powerless without a different fundamental relation to being God, right, is a traditional position, right? He's not the first person in history who says your psychology will not save you if you don't have ethics, and your ethics will not save you if you don't have the proper relationship to being. Just other people usually used a 3-letter word instead of a 5-letter word for being, one that begins with G. Okay. I think all this needs to be pointed out because it's to understand. The point is to say Heidegger is not here claiming a indifference to ethics. He's claiming a concern for something more fundamental than ethics, upon which ethics rests. And it is a substitute for ethical concern, where by substitute I mean meant to replace it by being deeper, right? Ethics, as he calls it, doctrine and imperative. He's thinking of Kant, right? Is only going to tell you what you should do, right? But it's not going to bring about the state in which you do it, right? It's like the ethical man knows that he shouldn't steal, and the moral man will not, right? Just knowing the ethical man will not steal doesn't help you, right? It's the same kind of claim being made here. Okay. So openness to being is being held out as the I'm gonna put it this way, the spiritual ideal here, and he's going to do that right before he gets into Nietzsche holding out deliverance from revenge as the ideal. He's disagreeing with Nietzsche's ideal. When someone tells you this is the thing which would actually be a saving of man's essential nature, and then does so as part of an interpretation of what Nietzsche says as part of saving of man's essential nature, and he's not repeating what Nietzsche is saying word for word, it's because he's disagreeing with him, right? Okay. Big things to notice. Go back a little bit further, beginning of even on page 88. Nietzsche's thinking focuses on the spirit of freedom from revenge. This is his alleged free thinking. Why does he say alleged free thinking there? What is he thinking of? Why is it alleged free thinking that Nietzsche focuses on the freedom from revenge? what does Nietzsche's free thinking usually denote to most people thinking of Nietzsche? Who are the free thinkers? Are free thinkers people who think in a disorganized fashion? Are they people who don't charge for their thinking? What is a free thinker? In 19th century German speak, a free thinker is someone who doubts religion in favor of philosophy, right? A free thinker is a atheist or near atheist who thinks his philosophical thought is more important than religion. But his alleged free thinking is about freedom from revenge. Heidegger is trying to situate Nietzsche within something like a German semi-religious, mystical, metaphysical, philosophical tradition in that spiritual realm, and to differentiate that from a, put it this way, a power politics, cynical atheist realm. He's saying Nietzsche is not a power politics thinker preaching atheism. He is someone who is looking to free mankind from revenge. He is a preacher of repentance, right? Heidegger, may disagree with what that repentance consists in, but he is detecting in Nietzsche a theological ambition, put it this way, a salvationist ambition to reform man's nature, the nature of man's relation to being in a way that will heal his soul. Okay, and he's differentiating that from thinking of him as a skeptic and a scoffer. Okay.
So in a sense, this is the sense that Nietzsche is a religious thinker because will to power, eternal recurrence of the same are beliefs.
Yes. Yes. And will to power may be a somewhat philosophical belief, but the eternal recurrence of the same is consciously a myth, right? And it's a myth embraced for the sake of its moral consequences for the person who embraces it, for the sake of deliverance from the spirit of revenge, right? So Heidegger is mostly trying to differentiate Nietzsche from a common impression of him in the day and time, and even a common one even today. There will be places later where he will allow that some of that impression is not simply completely unfounded, which I could bring up here, but wanting Caesar with the soul of Christ is a desire for Caesar and a criticism of Christ, right? This part of Nietzsche cannot be avoided, right? So the corrective needed, but the first thing I want to point out here is that that Heidegger in this whole 2 chapters is trying to shift you towards seeing when Nietzsche is talking about psychology and he seems to be moralizing, he's actually talking about metaphysics. And part of that is shifting this onto the plane of the, put it this way, the religious conceptions, the semi-religious conceptions, the philosophical conceptions that are religion adjacent, if I can put it that way. Okay. 92nd paragraph. In metaphysics in its widest meaning, in fact, the very core of metaphysics is the sphere where we must from the start place Nietzsche's thinking on revenge and deliverance from revenge. So the claim there is that he's trying to get you away from thinking this is about psychology or ethics, and instead it's going to take us into metaphysics. He says such remarks will take us step by step into a difficult landscape that is remote, however, from the early spaces and concepts of luxuriant abstractions. This landscape is the land on whose grounds all movements in our modern age take place. Strong claim. He's claiming that the things which are the actual world history directing movements take place in the sphere of these philosophical doctrines about these semi-theological subjects, something like that. And that the ethics and psychology themselves are derivative from it to say nothing of the politics, which is way downstream, right? So the claim here is that it's not a psychological movement. It's not a political movement. Any of those things on which all movements of our modern age take place, they take place on the ground of this metaphysics where Nietzsche's thinking on revenge properly belongs. Okay, all this is prefatory to introducing the will question. Dan.
Yeah, I think what you said, it links very well to the passage at the top of 109, where it's another passage from Nietzsche where he said, like, we created this heaviest thought to bring light into the world and to celebrate the future and to create mythos for the future and to live in hope, and then to say to shut the curtain again over this, and then to focus on ourselves to present purposes. It's kind of like you create Nietzsche's purpose to create a religion there, and then to found it, and then to create peace, kind of, or to bring happiness and tranquility.
Certainly to bring something. Yes, we'll get to the critique of to draw the curtain shut again, which is implied in the following paragraph from Heidegger. But I agree with you that quotation from Nietzsche is a sign that he knows that he's myth making. There are other places in the gay science in particular where he talks about it, where it's clear that he knows that's what he's doing. Okay. Yes, this is about clattering with kettle drums and preaching repentance. I'm quoting Nietzsche, who's making fun of himself. Okay, we got to the Schelling's text about there's in the final and highest instance, there's no being other than willing. Willing is primal being. So this is presented as the view of modern German metaphysics. I won't say all modern metaphysics, but modern German idealism specifically. And then he lists the things which are the attributes of primal being: unconditioned, eternity, independence of time, and self-affirmation. Being unconditioned, you can certainly see as an attribute of will, in the sense of will as free and free as unconditioned. Self-affirmation, you can certainly see in will. It's definitely an attribute of will. Eternity and independence of time are less obviously attributes of will. Much less. But they're something on which much of the remaining will turn. There are traditions which link those two, I almost want to say, but it is not obvious on first blush that willing has the attribute of independence of time. It is not obvious, at least traditional, that primal being has independence of time. But in most of the pre-German idealist traditions, this was taken as evidence of a division/distinction between will and primal being. If you go to Plotinus, you'll find eternity and primal being equated with what does not change, and will equated with the sphere of the soul or life as the world soul, as the principle of what changes in time. And so in that sense, you'll have a division between primal being and the sphere of will. There's another thing about will. In the medieval period, the will is understood as something which is a capacity for, I think that medieval period is the wrong way of putting this. Before and after the Aristotelians come back in, when most of the scholastic thought is still Platonic, the will is a less important term in the following sense. The proper attachment point of will is the good, and a will that wills the good is being determined by the good and not by the will. And a will that does not will the good is in rebellion against the good and is sin, right? So that's like the understanding you get in someone like Augustine. And the idea that the will as primal being has detached itself from good as primal being, is the point I want to make. And that detachment goes along with moving away from traditional Platonism to something else. Okay. I'm just explaining some of the pieces of the tradition here. We went to will. Why wasn't this will thought of the German idealists what you had in the entire tradition up until then? The answer is will is an innovation. Will as primal being is an innovation. What is an innovation from? Before that, you have one or good as primal being, not will. And will is not simply directed towards good in the moderns, whereas it was in the ancients. Dan.
Yeah, I think it's Kierkegaard who says something like compares, I think, Socrates with the moderns, and he said for Socrates will it's good, and he cannot understand if someone knows something or will something, it's necessarily the good. Well, for the moderns, it's far more than that, and it includes the not good or something else or more beside the good.
Yes, I would even say this: the Socratic thinks that if the mind truly understands the good, it seeks it, and if it doesn't seek it, it's because it doesn't understand its goodness. And the people who start objecting to that are really the early Christians, who think that that is a misunderstanding of evil, and that willfully doing the bad is the nature of sin, something like that. So they deny that good of itself is knowledge of good of itself is sufficient to cause the good to be willed, something like that.
And also for the mothers, that there is this new level of representations or that appear in between the kind of it's. I guess we need to manage that in order to do the good also, not just like it's more to
part of that has to,
understanding the good is not enough.
Part of that is the notion of there previously was the notion of it had to be properly understood, and this is kind of a replacement / extension of that. But you're right that the representational stuff really comes in with the moderns and people like Descartes as a kind of a new thing. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is that even when you had the idea of willfully doing the bad as sin, as being a lack of attachment to the good, there was still a notion that the good as the fundamental attachment point was normative and there. And what you get in the moderns is the will becomes free in the sense of undirected rather than free in the sense of able to sin, right? It loses its pole of only having a single thing that it ought to be directed to. It becomes the dispenser of what ought to be instead of the receiver of what ought to be. And that's because good as primal being has been dethroned. Being or will as primal being has replaced good as primal being in the medieval theologies, if I can put it that way. And certainly by the time you get to the early moderns, they're not thinking of primal being as being primarily good, and therefore, if I can put it this way, constrained to be reasonable, but as will and therefore as free, right? This is, you can think of it in theological terms as being like your dialogue of the Euthyphro, something like that. But anyway, I'm pointing out these changes because you have to see the German idealist tradition as being not something that has eternally been there in the whole history of Western metaphysics, but which is an innovation in the early modern period. James.
Yes, I'm trying to understand what you mean by this innovation.
Yes.
Because traditionally there is this, idealism, and the opposite of that is materialism. Right, that's the traditional, dualism of many philosophies, one or the other, or right. But in the modern, is there a kind of like a third way in between, where the will is something that can reconcile both the ideal and the material?
Most of the modern German idealists are idealists. They're not a third way between them. They may have their own way of understanding the real as opposed to the ideal. The traditional dichotomy is idealists versus realists, but the realists can include materialists as a proper subset. But that's not the only distinction in history of philosophy, something like that.
Right.
Even within idealists, Platonic idealists and German modern idealists don't agree on this point, right? So you don't get just these divisions across idealists versus non-idealists. You get them even within idealism. There's multiple kinds of idealism.
Mhm.
But the specific innovation that you get with will as primal being is that there is something that is regarded as free that is regarded as the highest, right? That's the specifically, I mean, I don't know if it's specifically modern innovation. It has precursors in some of the religious traditions earlier, but it's not something you get in the either the Aristotelian or the Platonic versions of Greek thought, and even the early modern theological positions that are motivated by that, or that are founded on that. The point that I'm getting at here is will as primal being and will as independence of time. There's a tension there because traditionally primal being and independence of time were absolutely equated, but precisely for that reason, primal being was not regarded as being will-like, because the ancients saw there being something temporal-like in will, if that makes sense. If you want to trace back, we'll come to a second where he talks about the idea of the standing now, the nunc stands. I think it's the beginning of 10, maybe the third page of 10. That notion, if you trace it back, I mean, the immediate context there he's thinking of is in Aquinas, but Aquinas gets it from Boethius, and Boethius has echoes in Augustine and foundations in Plotinus, right? The particular nunc stans idea is definitely sort of Boethius. But if you trace that tradition back, the nunc stans traditions will arrive at eternity as independence of time as primal being, absolutely, right? But for that very reason, will not regard will as being primal being. So the point, one of the points I'm making here is that there is more variety in this tradition than Heidegger is necessarily letting on. These people don't all agree with one another, right? There may be questions which are never revisited from Aristotle to Nietzsche, in which you can therefore see as like a common metaphysical structure that that lasts for all of them because it is unchanged. There also are definite innovations in all of that, and not every one of those innovations is one that Heidegger has examined. Okay, but the point of these two chapters is not primarily to give us an interpretation of all of metaphysics. It's primarily to give us an interpretation of Nietzsche. And to the extent that he's giving an interpretation of Nietzsche, I think he's on solid ground here. The parts of German idealism in Schelling that he's referencing here do recur in Schopenhauer and do recur in Nietzsche. He's not wrong that that sort of thought is at the basis of Nietzsche's own metaphysics, and comes from the same sources as you find in Schelling. It's just not the case that that is a straight unbroken line back to Plato or Aristotle, nothing like it. Okay. So some people mentioned at the beginning that they had trouble with this notion of primal being as will. We talked about that as not just the will of the individual single human being, but page 91, every single being and all beings as a whole have their essential powers in and through the will. That sounds strange to us and will remain strange as long as you remain strangers to the essential and simple thoughts of Occidental metaphysics. In other words, as long as you not think those thoughts, but merely go on forever reporting them. Guilty, I sometimes do that. I try to think them too, but I do report them a lot. Okay. Some of this is foreshadowing what we're going to get to in all part 2. Well, we'll get to the notion that thinking and being are the same. But the will aspect of it here is not simply thinking, but that every single being and all beings as a whole have their essential powers in and through the will, that this is something which is strange to us. Why is it so strange to us? Because we tend to be positivists, realist materialists. We tend not to be German idealists, right? Even when we're in other respects Kantians or Nietzscheans, we don't really get all of the idealism behind their position. What are the points of contact? When some points of contact, at least, when you get a you cannot even imagine the absence of consciousness in Husserl, right? That the consciousness is an absolute position, something like that in Husserl. This is a version of that. There are no views of the world that aren't from inside the will, that aren't from inside the consciousness, that aren't from inside a willed thing. That's the claim, right? And you may say, okay, but that's only views of. Fine. You don't have access to anything that isn't a view of. Okay. Even in the Heidegger standing before the tree, where he's going to insist that you and the tree are, and the meeting of you both occurs, there is still going to be that in that grounding back in the phenomena, a consciousness in the picture, right? So, okay, I don't know if that helps, but the phenomenology does not commit one to idealism, but it does commit one to recognizing that all the evidence for all the theories, even the realist theories, passes through the phenomena that appear in consciousness, right? All the data is in consciousness or passes through consciousness. Question: do we distinguish between appearance and being? If we do, we're Platonists. If we don't, we have problems. Can you not distinguish between appearance and being and not be an idealist? There's a question for you. One of Nietzsche's critique of Platonism is he wants to claim that Platonism or things like it put an ideal world behind the world because they are incapable of accepting the apparent world, something like that. The apparent world is morally unacceptable enough, or unacceptable enough to the will, that it cannot be accepted as being the real world. There has to be a more real world behind it, which is perhaps more rational, perhaps more fair, perhaps more eternal, but at any rate lacks some of the deficiencies that the consciousness or the will finds in the apparent world. This is Nietzsche's diagnosis of the nihilistic content of Western metaphysics as Platonism. He thinks that there's something about the trying to see an ideal world behind the world that is a denigration of the apparent world, that is a denigration of the world as it actually is. Because to Nietzsche, the apparent world is the world. And he's trying to abolish the distinction between them. Okay, he thinks that in doing that, he can overcome the nihilism in Platonic metaphysics, something like that. But that means he's committed to the proposition that how things appear is the way they actually are for us. And yes, there's a for us in that, but there isn't in anybody else that we would appeal to. Phil. You're on mute, Phil. I see the hand, but your Zoom mute button is highlighted. So I don't. There you go.
Great. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to be drawing on other Heidegger texts where Heidegger doesn't emphasize the will so much. And I'd like to sort of paint a picture for you, and then you tell me where will fits in here, okay? Like if we start with Descartes, we've got a split between subject and object. And I see the German idealist tradition as an attempt to heal that distinction, heal that split rather, but through a long, laborious, sometimes agonizing process, right? So Hegel, at the end of his work, he thinks he's given us everything a realist could possibly want. Yes, it's a form of idealism, but it's a form of idealism that culminates in a form of idealism that even the most realist person could say, yeah, that's enough realism for me. I'm okay with that. I see Heidegger and Nietzsche as not engaging in that long agonizing process. So for somebody like Heidegger, you are thrown into a situation. The split is just healed right from the start, right? You find yourself in a situation, let's say, you know, it's chopping wood, right? A typical Heidegger example. So there you are, you've been thrown into the situation of chopping wood, and the split between subject and object just doesn't arise unless you, like, if it does, it's a derivative thing. It's not the primordial facts that are jumping out at you. Okay, so I think that this would put Heidegger at odds with the German idealist tradition, in that Heidegger doesn't feel the need for the long agonizing process to heal the split between subject and object. He feels he has a starting point where that distinction just doesn't arise. And I think Nietzsche as well is trying to circumvent the long agonizing process of healing the split. So far, that puts Heidegger and Nietzsche on the same side. But the thing about Heidegger is, at least in Being and Time, there's not a lot of role for the will, right? You just happen to find yourself thrown into that situation. You do what anyone would do in that situation, for the most part. So I'm surprised in this book to see how much Heidegger is talking about the will. Could you say something about exactly why Heidegger is talking so much about will here when he tends not to in his other works? I'll stop there.
That's easy. He's interpreting Nietzsche, right? It's not his emphasis on the will that he's interpreting. It's Nietzsche's. That's it. There's no deeper secret than that. Because he's explicating Nietzsche's actual own metaphysical position, and because the will is central to it and to previous German idealism for that matter, he has to, bring it up and emphasize it at every turn. The will in Nietzsche is everything that Dasein replaces and existence replaces in Heidegger. So Nietzsche doesn't have a Dasein. He has a will to power even, right? So as for the long roundabout, the long roundabout is an attempt to save something like an exhaustive rationalism or system, and that's not there in Nietzsche. Nietzsche is going to make the representational, exhaustive, rational mind a mere tool of the impulses, drives, life, etc. Right? He's going to subordinate the representation to the will in Schopenhauerian terms. So that's the reason that you don't find the full long way round. That being said, there's more of a system in Nietzsche than Nietzsche lets on with his aphoristic, manner, and that's part of what Heidegger is bringing out here, is that there is a full metaphysical system in Nietzsche, even if it's not, a phenomenology of spirit, right? There is a way in which all of his essential doctrines about appearance, will, how time is, all cohere with one another and found themselves on a Schopenhauerian will as fundament, something like that. Okay, I don't know if that addressed all.
It does, and we're on the same page there. Like, I also would say, yeah, he's talking about willing because he's explicating Nietzsche. However, Heidegger never explicates any philosopher unless it's to somehow shed light on Heidegger's own thinking. So I can't help but think that his explication of Nietzsche's willing is somehow meant to shed light on Heidegger's own project.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's what I'm somewhat mystified by. And again, I haven't done the reading of this particular book. So if you want to wait until
there's lots of things we can talk about his relationship to Nietzsche, but fundamentally, Heidegger treats Nietzsche as the last metaphysician in the metaphysical tradition of the West, and he thinks that Nietzsche is trying to overcome a nihilism that Nietzsche detects in the history of Western philosophy, but that Heidegger thinks Nietzsche does not succeed in that and remains mired and enmeshed in the nihilist-like thing that he has diagnosed. And the nihilist-like thing that he has diagnosed is more properly understood, according to Heidegger, not as nihilism, but as metaphysics. Right? So that's what he means by saying that Nietzsche is the last metaphysical thinker of the Western tradition. He thinks it's last because he thinks in Nietzsche that metaphysical tradition has reached its end, that it's over, and not necessarily over in the sense that it will not continue to persist for quite a while, but in the sense that its fundamental positions have been sketched. All of the fundamental positions have been laid out. There will be Nietzscheans and Fichtians and Hegelians and Leibnizians in the future, but there isn't another position waiting after Nietzsche that is going to be some new move on each of them that remains in metaphysics, but it differs from them all, according to Heidegger. Much of that sort of analysis of Nietzsche's position within the tradition of Western metaphysics is laid out in the Nietzsche books rather than in this stuff. Here, he's in a much shorter form trying to show just that Nietzsche is a metaphysician, and that the issues Heidegger has with metaphysics apply to Nietzsche too. Nietzsche is not free of them. There are plenty of people around at the time who believed that Nietzsche had broke out of Platonism and had gone to a new terrain or something like that. And Heidegger thinks, no, he hasn't. He's still in the domain of metaphysics. So I don't know if that helps in just sort of the doxology aspect of where he's going.
Yeah, that does. I'll ask you just a quick question.
I misread Megan's message.
Yeah.
She said, want to come over around 6.
So Isabel, you
We'll be
mute
forcing
yourself. We
in
can.
dinner at 6:30.
Isabel, could you mute yourself? All right, sorry. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'll ask this as a question to guide my future reading here. So Nietzsche's use of willing, is this something that Heidegger is just going to say ends with Nietzsche? Like that is contained within Nietzsche's philosophy and it ends with him? Or is Heidegger going to take Nietzsche's notion of willing and transform it into something within Heidegger's own philosophy?
So will as an understanding of something like primal being in Nietzsche has been fully replaced and fully done away with, but its replacement is something like the notion of the role Dasein plays in Heidegger's own understanding.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. No, we're on the same page here. Yeah. Okay. That's great. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Fair questions. Okay. Did someone else have a? Sorry, Dan. Go ahead.
I want to go back to your question and also to this issue of metaphysics. Like you ask if there is something like the ideal disposition. Is there something, all that there is in there in appearance, or is there something beyond? And I think Heidegger, like he starts like with this metaphysics, also relates to metaphysics. So starts like physics is what's there, and metaphysics is like from Aristotle, it's what's beyond, and there is something beyond, and he started with Aristotle. And I think Heidegger will say that for him, everything there is there in appearance, including the ground is there, except that it's so close to us that, and we are so kind of enmeshed in metaphysics that we are not able to see the ground because it's so close to us. So I think for Heidegger, he's not an idealist in any way or a realist, but for him, everything it's out there, including the ground. It's in front, there's nothing beyond. And
so I'm going to partly agree with you in the sense that Heidegger wants to found any of these things in the phenomenal evidence. And that for him is, I don't even want to say it's the ground. It's an anchor point in actuality, something like that, which is his substitute for the role of appearance in Nietzsche. The role of in Nietzsche, you have the notion of the apparent world being the only world there is, and all of the real world supposedly behind it being, made up fictions, something like that. And Heidegger does not ascribe to that diagnosis on Nietzsche's part. In the part you're alluding to on page 98, where he talks about the facing what is the meta that is beyond it, to have seen this meta, that is to have thought it, is the simple and thus inexhaustible meaning of all Greek thought. The idea of what is in itself metaphysical. I put it to you that there Heidegger is accepting the discovery of the real world behind the apparent world on the part of someone like Plato as in keeping with the evidence and not a mistake. Nietzsche thinks that there is an element of revenge upon what the apparent world in that, and Heidegger is not simply accepting that. Heidegger is more accepting of this as a fundamental discovery of Greek thought that deserves to be preserved and not something that needs to be overturned in the way that Nietzsche did think it needed to be overturned. So, and that's just there in saying that this is the simple and inexhaustible meaning of all Greek thought. The discovery of the distinction between the real and the apparent world is not a mistake for Heidegger, but that's not to say that there aren't things that the Platonic tradition or metaphysical tradition more generally thinks about the real world that Heidegger doesn't think are true, right? Specifically about its relations to time, right, which we'll be getting to. But so he first of all, just an interpretation. He says, when Nietzsche thinks of revenge as the fundamental characteristic of the way ideas have been formed so far, he thinks of revenge metaphysically, not psychologically, and not only morally, meaning morally, but not only morally. So Heidegger is, I think, correctly interpreting Nietzsche as seeing there as being something like a spirit of revenge in the very idea of this meta that is the characteristic thing in Greek thought, right? Heidegger, does agree that that characteristic thing in Greek thought is there, but he doesn't think that it's the spirit of revenge that's behind it. He thinks there's phenomenal evidence of the meta. What's the phenomenal evidence of the meta? A simple example is time persists. That's a meta. Every always already structure you get in being in time or basic problems of phenomenology is such a meta, right? So Heidegger denies that those things are fundamentally a matter of a psychological motivation of a dislike of the world and a distortion. He doesn't see revenge in them. He sees noticing in them. There's an openness to what is in them that Heidegger is far more appreciative of and Nietzsche is much more suspicious of, right? A psychologist, not necessarily Heidegger, might see some of the ascription of revenge as the motive behind such seeings in Nietzsche as projection, meaning something of which Nietzsche is occasionally guilty, as you can see in the excesses of his last 3 or 4 books. So this is a complicated relationship because Heidegger is agreeing with Nietzsche that there is this noticing of the meta as something fundamental in Greek thought, but he doesn't have the negative reaction to it that Nietzsche has, right? Even though it's part of the structure of metaphysics that Heidegger has his own issues with. I don't know, does that help, Dan? Okay. There's a broader point besides the Greek part side of it of Heidegger wants to found things in the apparent world as found things in the phenomena, as found things in the, the interior of experience. He doesn't want to see the world as will to power, but viewed from the inside. He wants to see the world as viewed from, even inside, but viewed phenomenally as it actually appears. And he doesn't think that's an inside anymore. He thinks the inside is outside. He thinks the Dasein is always already plugged into the world. So in that sense, he is much less skeptical of a pole that the moderns viewed as subjective and therefore implicitly potentially misleading. This goes back to the point I think Phil was making about, sort of a level of immediate acceptance. We saw that in the last time in the tree on the meadow. Okay. All right. Let's talk about revenge itself. The will's revulsion against time and its it was. Repeated multiple times. In what sense is the will revolted by time and by the it was specifically. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but does anyone have thoughts on this? This is, I think, in 92 to 95, or what, 92, 93? Yeah, 295, before he gets to the Aristotle passage. How clear or unclear was any of this? Most
So
of this is, go ahead. Go ahead, Pete.
The reason that we're caught up with this feeling requiring revenge is because we look to the past and we see things that we're not comfortable with now. And that's our origin of wanting revenge to change the past, but we can't change the past.
Yes, I mean, think about whenever anyone objects to any real or historical or injustice, right? They're not objecting to the injustice of what will happen next week, right? They're objecting to the injustice of what just happened, right? And cannot be undone. It's the permanence of the wrong and the inability to undo the permanently wrong that is the thing that the will finds revolting, right? Think of any past atrocity. Think of atrocity mongering with the past in general. Think of weaponizing the past for the sake of resentments and divisions in practical political life, right? All of them have the characteristic that you can cite as something that happened that shouldn't have happened, right? And that creates a spirit of revulsion that is so, a spirit of, he says, the desire for punishment is what this dresses it up itself as. Punishment, that is what revenge calls itself with a lying word. It counterfeits a good conscience. Punishment and justice. The desire for punishment and justice is the desire to rectify past wrongs by doing something now that is vengeful. Doing something now as revenge will. It's not that it will undo a past wrong. It's that it's the pathetic most that the will can accomplish in the present about a past it was before which it is actually powerless, right? So this is how, if you put it this way, the problem of evil appears to the will to power, right? James.
Is he, critiquing Nietzsche's the original idea of the will to power? Is that the problem?
He's not critiquing that idea here. He's first just explicating what Nietzsche himself is explaining here, and Heidegger is not disagreeing that will to power characterizes the drive of life or something like that. There are things in that understanding that Heidegger, disagrees with. Back when we talked about the difference in saving power, right? Deliverance from revenge was not what Heidegger diagnosed as saving power, but man holding himself open to being and having a different fundamental relationship to it. So we know that he's going to disagree with Nietzsche about what needs to be changed or corrected in any way. So to that degree, he is disagreeing with stuff that Nietzsche is laying out here as how one can be delivered from the spirit of revenge. But none of that is directly critiquing just the will to power idea as like the place where Nietzsche went wrong or something. Nothing like that.
But Heidegger is not going to adopt that the idea of will to power as the primordial being, right?
No, but he's also not going to hang his critique of Nietzsche on that.
Okay.
Phil?
Yeah, I've got a question about a line. It's on page 92. It's
Yep.
roughly in the middle of the page, a little bit towards the bottom. So it's faced with every it was. Willing no longer has anything to propose. Now, I'm not entirely clear if Heidegger here is stating the standard view or if he's explicating Nietzsche's view. But if he's explicating Nietzsche's view, that's a problem, because the eternal recurrence idea in Nietzsche is specifically meant to say, well, look at what happened to you in the past. Do you will for it to happen again? In other words, what was past will become present. You can will it to be that way. Now, it's very hard to explicate exactly what Nietzsche means by the eternal recurrence. Like, even if it doesn't literally happen, at the very least, it is a way of willing, like you sort of endorsing what happened in the past. Is that a problem for Nietzsche, for Heidegger's reading here? I'll stop there.
It's not a problem for it. He's explaining what the why there is a motive for the eternal return at all in the first place. The first point is that before it thinks it can will backward by willing forward because of a cyclicality of what is, the will is just confronted with the fact that it only wills forward, and only willing forward, it cannot change the past. It can only retribute for the past. It can only punish, right? Which is a measure of weakness, frustrated with the inability to will backward. From Heidegger's point of view, the doctrine of the eternal return is in part an attempt to let the will backwards by willing forwards, by claiming that what is recurs. So if you will forward, you're also changing the past. There is a notion of the will being able to will in both directions, which he brings up. Where does he put this? He says, you might not notice it, but the will can will in reverse based on this. It's on 105. As the will of the eternal recurrence of the same, the will can will in reverse. It will never encounter in any direction any fixed bygones that it could no longer will. So the point that he's making there on 105 is that the recurrence is meant to has the mythical effect, so to speak, of changing the complete pastness of the past by making it also a future. So
isn't that enough? Sorry.
So you could argue about, how could that possibly work or something like that. But the psychological, if I can put this way, trick of it is to have everything about a past, to, as Nietzsche puts it, to live in hope. This is the section which was the quote with the curtain quote. So off a little bit later than that. Yes, on 109, right? To celebrate the future, not the past, to write the mythos of the future, to live in hope, blissful moments. So there is a desire to make the entirety of history a matter of the future, because that's the direction in which the will can feel alive. Dan.
Yeah, it's a passage here on page, what page is this, 94. And it seems like he takes this spirit of revenge and so beyond the past and time. And I think this is Heidegger's. He said, now, if the spirit of revenge determines all thinking so far, then this thinking is essentially a forming of idea. So, and he says, this is the essence of representational ideas. So everything that is related to ideas and representational ideas is to Heidegger connected to the spirit of revenge.
To Heidegger, according to Nietzsche, not necessarily to Heidegger, but you put your finger on a critical point we have to get to, but this is a place where there is something in idea thinking itself, in representational thinking itself, which has an element of rebellion against time as it actually is within it. What is this? What's going on here, right? So we have to think platonically for a second, right? We have to realize that the essence of something in Platonic terms is that aspect of it that is being like in the Platonic sense, because it is eternal, unchanging, logical, and consistent. You can rely upon it. You can rely upon it to transcend time. It won't squiggle out from under you. It will not change on you. That is what essential thinking gets you to. So the representations are an attempt to take the chaotic flux of unknowably differentiated experience and impose upon it a net of sameness, reliability, and essentiality. And the essentiality that is imposed upon it by the representational ideas get called the beings, get called the essence of things. So the mere appearances may shift around on you, but the essences supposedly don't. So the replacement of the phenomenal appearing world with all of its change and unreliability with a world of permanent logical concepts behind it upon which you can rely is not, to the Platonist, as Nietzsche would put it, a kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live, that is distorting the phenomena, but is a peering behind the veil of a mere appearance that is delusion, that would otherwise delude us, and replacing it with a reliable permanence, something like that. Nietzsche detects in the desire to replace the chaotic foreground with the reliable and permanent a dislike of the foreground, right? A resentment of the ungovernability of the foreground and an alienation from life. It's an attempting to live in a fictional world of representation that is more ordered and stable than the actual phenomenal world to Nietzsche. So it is Nietzsche who is diagnosing there as being some element of resentment for the chaos of life, something like that, in representational thinking as such. And Heidegger is here just recording the fact that Nietzsche's diagnosis of resentment isn't just for particular moral doctrines. It extends all the way to conceptual thinking itself, to the extent that conceptual thinking relies upon a distinction between the apparent and the real world, and believes only the real world, only the logical world, only the behind the world is real, right? Okay. And from Nietzsche's point of view, this is an attempt to escape the reality of change, right?
One more thing, that sentence ends up with saying, and so far is moving, even Nietzsche's own thinking. So Heidegger is saying Nietzsche's own thinking is this kind of representational ideas, and condemns it.
We'll get to that. The question is there a rebellion against an attempt to escape change itself, even in Nietzsche's metaphysical thought? In the idea of the eternal recurrence, for example, which is the closest approximation to a world of being possible in a world of becoming. Why does he want to approximate the world of being, and what does he mean by approximating the world of being? He means approximating an eternity and a world of permanence, and he wants to approximate that. Why does he call it the peak of the meditation to approximate that? Because there is something in Nietzsche which is still trying to get to being, and that is still running from becoming, and is still in revolt against the it was, and wants to put it off in the future instead of leaving it in the past where it actually is, right? So Heidegger, in his interpretation, is also diagnosing the residual Platonism in Nietzsche's own position, right? And he's not necessarily endorsing all of Nietzsche's critiques of traditional metaphysics in doing so. He's recognizing that Nietzsche's own indictments hit himself. Does that help? James?
So would you say that Nietzsche starts out as an anti-idealist, right? But he ends up being one, and Heidegger is, analyzing and critiquing that. And so
Nietzsche doesn't start out as an anti-idealist. He's an anti-rationalist.
Anti-rationalist.
And he doesn't like the real world, apparent world distinction in Plato, and that is what he thinks he is overturning. But he's not overturning that because it is idealist. He's overturning it because it denigrates from the reality and value of the apparent world. And why does he want to live in the apparent world? In part because he thinks the apparent world is the actual world, and in part because he thinks that the acceptance and embrace of the apparent is the only yes to life. He's detected in the Schopenhauerian weariness of will and dislike of will, a weariness with life itself, that he's trying to reverse, overcome. Schopenhauerian pessimism is his immediate target, and Platonic real world behind the apparent world is the means.
So when Heidegger, goes on to adopt the Dasein, does he replace the will to power, or is it part of his Dasein?
Dasein is precisely not will or will to power, because it is not trying to conquer being, it is trying to listen to and be receptive of being. And it has replaced a desire to conquer with a desire to know. It wants to be open to truth. And that means it has replaced a primary outward directed conquering drive with a primary receptive, open, wondering drive.
So you're saying that knowledge replaces the will?
I'm sorry, I could not hear.
The knowledge replaces the will?
Knowledge in the sense of thought, in the sense of openness to being, in the sense of openness to experience, yes. Knowledge in the sense of representation, in the sense of conformity between thought and being, no. So he has a new notion of truth that goes along with this, but the way he puts it is that man is the shepherd of being, and his mission is to hold himself open to being as far as he can, and thereby to bear witness to what is, something like that. He is the place or site where the truth of being is revealed.
Sure. But then if Nietzsche would respond, could Nietzsche say that he's doing what Schopenhauer did by denying life, by denying the will? Is it a denial of the will or partial?
Yeah, I don't think there's any denial of the will in it. But would Nietzsche be simply satisfied with the releasement that you see praised in the late Heidegger? Certainly not. He would consider it far too quietist for him, right? But it's not Schopenhauerian pessimism. Schopenhauerian pessimism is the idea that the will itself is selfish to the point of evil and ought not to be. And there's none of that in Heidegger. Does that help?
Yeah. I was just wondering, where the will goes. Is it just accepted as part of the knowledge?
Just you got major audio problems. I can only hear every other word.
So yeah, so the idea of the will is absorbed into this idea of knowledge for Heidegger.
I don't think primarily it's about knowledge. I mean, but and it's not primarily that will. The replacement for will is Dasein as existence, as there being, as the place or site where truth happens, and the extent that there's a replacement of will in that, it's more like accepting the calling to be the place where truth is revealed. And we'll get to the idea of that as a calling in the second half of the book.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I see that Jason Benton just joined us. I realize you're coming late, and I don't know if you are following anything, but did you have any comments you wanted to share with us, or just happy to lurk, or give you a chance?
Well, I'm just going to listen to you guys, and I'll catch up as you talk.
Great. Okay. Right. And these are all wonderful questions about Heidegger's basic attitude. I want to give a little bit of an assessment here of, I'm pulling back a little bit, of what Heidegger is accomplishing in these chapters. So we have to talk a little bit about the time aspect first. Sorry, Phil, did you have a comment before I go on?
Yeah, just really to address James's issue, I think it's useful to see Heidegger not so much as trying to answer the questions from the philosophical tradition as to find ways of bypassing those questions. So, his idea of being thrown into a situation and what you encounter phenomenologically as a phenomenologist as you are thrown into a concrete situation, Heidegger believes that this just allows you to bypass a lot of the traditional questions. And once you've done that, and once you've seen what the view is like from that phenomenological standpoint, then it gives you a vantage point on the other parts of the philosophical tradition, sure, but he's not like, Heidegger's not like Hegel, who's trying to ask the questions the way the tradition asked them and then answer them. Heidegger wants to bypass the traditional questions. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I don't know that it's simply bypass. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and he certainly is not a Hegel systematizer, but he has definite strong criticisms of contemporary views, meaning contemporary with himself, and still current today. And he is trying to not only answer some questions differently than those other traditions answer them, but he's also trying to ask questions he thinks they can't answer, and he can. So part of that is the traditional, I can pose a question that my philosophy can answer that your philosophy cannot answer. Competition, if I can put it that way, with other schools of thought. Pete, was there a comment?
Yeah, so also in response to James, where is the will to power in Heidegger? And I think by analogy, Heidegger would use meaningfulness for what Nietzsche is using will to power. And my simple example would be in the workshop when the carpenter is making a chair, or he's looking at his hammer to figure out why it doesn't work. In one place, it's the will to power to make a chair, and the other one is the will to power to understand why the hammer's broken. You're looking at, it's the meaning.
So
the chair is meaningful, the hammer's meaningful, but there's different contexts.
Sure, but to the extent that we are in the meaning web of an equipmental contexture with definite set purposes, we fit into the technical understanding of the world that is going to be more or less similar to what you get in a Nietzschean understanding of things. The place where there's sharp differences between them is when you're outside of the equipmental contexture alone. When you're dealing with questions of the revealing of being, so to speak, or the revealing of truth. Yes, there is practical meaning in those practical contexts of the equipmental contexture, and that's a place where the views of meaning that you get in Heidegger and the views of values for our purposes that you get in Nietzsche may dovetail quite a bit. It's why the pragmatists liked Heidegger's analysis of the life world. It's why Nietzschean pragmatists like Rorty like this aspect of Heidegger, especially the early Heidegger. But you're not going to find them going to releasement or the event or the clearing. None of those things are things which appeal to the ideas are just tools for the purposes of our drives aspect of Nietzschean will to power or pragmatism.
Fair enough. I picked the equipmental context because it's familiar.
It's close. It's also where they're close. I get it. Yeah, it's where they're close.
Yeah, but also historically, Nietzsche understands the will to power as different in different historical periods, and Heidegger understands how we come up with meaningfulness is different in different historical
relative to its context. Sure. Fair. Okay. I want to pull back to the question of, do we understand being on the category of on the horizon of time, or time on the horizon of being, or vice versa, and how, right? Because this is part of what he's claiming he's getting at here, which is that so there's a typical knot that he's detecting in metaphysics. He's also detecting in the Nietzsche metaphysics here. The claim is that when he wants to understand primal being, Nietzsche is going to be driven to something like a proper attitude towards time as being the saving thing. The saving thing is something like a proper attitude towards time, which in Nietzsche's case is a particular view of past and future that is the eternal return, right? That is the eternal recurrence of the same. And that is meant to be as close an approximation to a world of being as is possible in a world of pure becoming. So you have a dichotomy between a world of becoming and a world of being there, and you're trying to approximate a world of being. And what does it mean to approximate a world of being? The answer is to make as recurrent and thus as perduring and thus as infinite or eternal as possible what passes. The beings are experienced in the world of becoming as what passes, but you want to be able to treat them as though they had the weight and importance of a full being, as though they were eternal. So trying to take temporal things and eternalize them is the particular function or move on things, the operation, the function it applies to things that the eternal return as a mythos does. It lets you relate to temporal things as though they were eternal. James, question?
Yeah, this idea of do you think that Nietzsche might have meant that if it's a part of becoming, how can it be repeated as the same? So
we know exactly how he thought it. I mean, we can find the idea as silly as we like, but in Zarathustra, he tells us flat out that the answer is he imagines a infinity of time and a finitude of states, and that's it. That's enough to prove that it must recur, it must cycle. So, how much is that the reason he believes it, and how much is that as an argument he lays out there as a little lure for people? You can ask yourself that. But he means it to be possible to take it literally, in the sense that something that happens once doesn't just happen once. He wants a cyclical cosmos, right? And why does he want a cyclical cosmos? That's the actual interesting question. He wants a cyclical cosmos so that something which happens in time doesn't only happen once, but takes on the attributes of a not one-time event, but an eternally recurring event. He wants to weigh individual temporal occurrences down with all the freight of eternity. Dan?
yeah, the modern philosopher Gilles Deleuze interprets that in his book, I think, Difference in Repetition, that's not what Nietzsche really meant. It's not a cosmological position, but it's an ethical position.
It's both. There's an ethical, and psychological, and as Heidegger is arguing here, metaphysical motive behind teaching it. But that's not to say that the thing that is being taught isn't a cosmic myth. It is. The cosmic myth may be taught for the sake of its ethical implications, but all those implications come from treating something temporal, future or past, as a indifferent in direction, recurring, eternity-laden thing. That's it. You don't get any ethical bang back out of it unless you're treating the temporal occurrence that way.
That's similar
Sorry.
to, is that similar to?
Sorry, I have to make room for other folks. Sorry, Dan was next.
Yeah, I was just wanted to mention one thing here. We have this, I think in mathematics, we have kind of like the infinity, and we have all kind of, I don't know, paradoxes, and we like to carry that kind of thinking to the real world. So in mathematics, if something is infinite, like for example, the universe is infinite, everything happens, should happen, and it happens in fact infinitely many times. But I think Nietzsche's thinking is much stronger than that. It's kind of like these things that repeat itself eternally. It's something that happens in more like in a limited time. It's more like, it's not that kind of loose thinking that we have with the concept, like associate the concept of infinity in mathematics. I think Nietzsche is saying something much more stronger than that. That this eternal recurrence is in our kind of not so infinite time.
Except the word eternal is there, right? And not only that, if you go to Zarathustra, right, he'll say, why do you think that this could possibly happen? And he says, well, wherever I found force, there I found number, for she has more force, right? So he's appealing to number and finitude for the states, and the word eternity includes an infinity and time in the very concept. And to the extent that there is loose thinking involved in it, absolutely. And this is the point that I think Pete made. When you go through all the ways in which all the things Nietzsche ever said about it, you'll find that it's a mess, right? As an actual doctrine, it's a mess, right? He says different things at different times, different meanings put upon it. but that's because it may not be the most coherent thought in the world, right? It's not even really trying to be that coherent a thought. It's trying to be a myth. And myths are things which are proposed for the sake of the lessons drawn from them. There is a whole theory of what values are in Nietzsche, and the purpose of values is to govern man's conduct. It's not to conform to an absolute or objective standard of things. Truths are the kinds of errors with creatures like us cannot live, and they are for our purposes, and they are made by art, and therefore sometimes the lie is worth more than truth, or art is worth more than truth. We get this all over the place in Nietzsche. He is the conscious myth maker for the sake of the lessons to be drawn from it. But how can you draw any lessons from it unless you see the content of it? The content of it is meant to freight down with a recurring eternal temporal weight things which would otherwise be fleeting single temporal occurrences. He wants to eliminate the idea that something as a fleeting temporal occurrence is therefore unimportant. He wants to freight the momentary with the weight of eternity. And he's doing this consciously to approximate a world of being in a world of becoming. He thinks he actually is in a world of becoming, but he wants to morally approximate to the weight of a world of being within it. Okay, so I think that that's just clear in what Nietzsche's own sort of motivations are on this. It's not a matter of, can I find a logical way to put the puzzle together, because it's fundamentally not a logic puzzle. It's a story with a motive meant to arrive at a result, but you can't even see the point of it if you can't see the result it's trying to arrive at. And the result it's trying to arrive at is to use the fact that people think that something which is eternal, or something which recurs, or something which isn't a one-time thing is more important for that very reason, and more real for that very reason, than a momentary occurrence. And Heidegger is pointing out that is a residual Platonism in Nietzsche, right? He thinks of the one time as the less important, less real, and less valuable, even in the process of trying to overturn Platonic metaphysics. Sorry, Phil had a question or comment?
Yeah. I'm wondering how to fit the idea of revenge with the idea of the eternal recurrence, because I see a lot of room for revenge in other parts of Nietzsche's philosophy, but when it comes to the eternal recurrence, it seems like that's more a moment of quietism or acceptance or something like that.
It's designed to be. It's designed to. Hang on. It's designed to be the overcoming of the spirit of revenge, right? The design is, in order to be delivered from the spirit of revenge, we have to accept the eternal recurrence of the same, so that we are willing that eternal, as it is, as it was, as it shall be, and thus so again, and thus so again, right? As this sort of world affirmation that is meant to be deliverance from revenge. But why is it deliverance from revenge? It's deliverance from revenge because it's gotten rid of the revolt, according to Heidegger at least, it's gotten rid of the revolting nature of the unrecoverable past as past. But it's also done so while retaining, from Heidegger's point of view, the same, put it this way, temporal motive of not reconciled to the transitoriness of existence. He's not saying the reason that you should release from resentment, or the way that you should release from resentment, is to accept the one-time unique transitoriness of existence and find a quietist affirmation in that, regardless of whatever was. Nothing like it, right? So there's still this element that if it's weightier if it is longer, it's weightier if it is more, it's weightier if it, in the temporal sense, it's weightier if it is eternal, that is being appealed to by the myth itself. Now, you could charitably say this isn't because Nietzsche thinks that, it's because he's trying to appeal to a world in which that is the dominant belief or understanding that he is attempting to overthrow or something. Maybe. That's not how Heidegger reads it. Heidegger reads it as the relation to time itself that you're getting in Nietzsche still has elements of Platonism in it. There's another question, Phil? Can't tell. Maybe not. By the way, I should, it should be, I don't, it may not be obvious to people, but for me, something about someone's relationship to time still having elements of Platonism in it is not to me a criticism, but it is to other people because they're less Platonist than I am. But I want to get away from the revenge stuff for a second, and I want to get back to this relation to time thing, because Heidegger is making an allegation about where Nietzsche is on the time question, right? And what is it? It is that he's trying to revalue values in a way that makes the eternal less important and the temporal more important. And his means of doing so is to approximate to a world of eternity. First point. And second, that in doing so, he is everywhere assuming that what we mean by the being that is at each of those moments is a being at that moment, which is only the present at that moment. In the whole eternal return, the past and the future are there, but they're there as presence when their time comes around, right? They are still not there in the individual presence. Only the actual present is present. So actuality and present are equated, is the claim. So he claims that this is still Aristotelian time, and making it an eternal circle has not broken it out of being a being is present being notion of being. Why does this matter? The claim is that being is being understood as being the present moment on the category of time, and time is something to be overcome by eternalizing it, by making it recur so that it can approximate being. Okay. Heidegger's question is childhood simple. Chicken, egg. Is being built on time, or is time built on being? Choose. So he's detecting a metaphysical unthought or a system building incoherence in the notion of being that is being used to define the now, being founded on a notion of time that the eternal recurrence notion of time contradicts, right? And even the motive for trying to eternalize it contradicts. I don't know how coherent this is, but the Heidegger has his own detailed phenomenological understanding of the relationship between being and time, famously in the book of that name and in the later portions of basic problems of phenomenology. And in that understanding, being is understood on the horizon of time, full stop. You don't get to do it the other way around, right? And he thinks that is simply the phenomenal evidence. Theories which try to found, time on being are wrong. They're backward. Phenomenologically, the evidence contradicts it. That's the claim, right? So Heidegger calls this not the unthought matter in metaphysics, in that they do not know which to put first, time or being, and they flip-flop on it depending on what they're using being for and which notion of time they're using to mean it. Okay. This problem has a long prehistory. Heidegger has not fully established the point here. He's just pointed out that Nietzsche has the same knot in him, I think fairly. But the claim is that all of Western metaphysics has that knot. Okay. Why do I say he hasn't established this here? He hasn't. You can't say something is true of all of Western metaphysics without examining the different positions on the subject in the history of Western metaphysics and showing that all of them have it. First point, right? And he's only examining one position here, and a few glances at Aristotle and Aquinas's Nunc Stans, right? That's about it. Does he examine all the other ones in the places in being and time, or the places in basic problems of phenomenology where he actually gets into this time phenomenology in detail? Answer, no. Right? He deals with Aristotle's notion on it, and he asserts that the other ones are all derived from Aristotle on it and haven't had new thoughts on the topic. In the course of doing that, he mentions other people along the way that are there in the tradition, but should be, that might be mentioned as people have had deep thoughts on this. and Plotinus appears. And when Plotinus appears, there's a quick reference to ontotheology, and then a quick reference to this goes nowhere, and he's done. And 3 pages before, he'll tell you that if we look at the mythical understandings of these things, we can find interesting things there to learn, right, or something. So there's a giant difference between how much you can learn from myth and how much you can't learn from Plotinus, because it's headed towards theology, and everyone knows that's a dry hole. Okay, that's all you get on Plotinus on time. If you want to know the theoretical background of the Nunc Stans, you have to go to Plotinus. You have to go to Aeneid's 3:7 on time and eternity, and what we find there, you'll find a complete takedown of Aristotle's notion that time is a matter of measurement or measurement of motion, along with a consistent, Platonic understanding of the distinction between time and eternity, that gives a picture of time as the moving image of eternity that was the standard one in Neoplatonism. Okay, why does this matter? Because an enormous amount of the tradition that Heidegger is lumping in as metaphysics and is reacting to here, especially the more Platonist sides of it, are entirely dominated by that Neoplatonic understanding of time, not the Aristotelian one. Okay. And Heidegger basically just takes it as granted that everyone rejects that. It's not granted, right? But okay, the closest you get to a reference to it here is when he talks about the Nunc Stans, which means the standing now, the now that stands. The Nunc Stans is as he correctly puts it, a scholastic concept of this. And it's distinguished from the Nunc Fluens, the now that moves, the now that flows, right? There's the now that flows, which is the now of the temporal crest between past and future, and he presents that as being the same as the Nunc Stans, more or less. But the Nunc Stans idea is the idea that eternity is unaffected by the category of time outside time that can only loosely be called an eternal present, right? But this is the closest he gets to the tradition calling that thing, that when I say that thing, I mean an eternity that is actually independent of time, a present, and therefore understanding it as a time word. Before Plotinus, the other place you get something on this is in Plato's Parmenides, between the first and the second contradictions of Parmenides' discussion. When Parmenides is trying to explain why the one, well, he explains that the one is not, and the first proof that the one is not is that if it were affected by the category of the time, it would have past, present, and future in it, and therefore it would be many and not one, basically. So affected by time correlates with not one. And then that is immediately followed up by, in the second contradiction passage, you have basically a being that appears but is not, that is the sort of becoming version. Why do I bring this up? Because you can ground the stuff you find in Plotinus back in that stuff in Plato's Parmenides, and therefore some of it may go back to Parmenides himself. What are both Plotinus and Parmenides doing there? The answer is they're doing idealist rationalism, meaning they're thinking that they can spin out these relationships by examining the meanings of the concepts themselves and our intentions about them, something like that. We're going to get to Parmenides in the whole second half of this book, and the question about whether or not being and thinking are the same, which is, if you like, the founding doctrine of something like an idealistic metaphysics of that kind. Okay. The Neoplatonic understanding of eternity rather than time is not here. He's taking it as read, taking it as accepted by everyone in the debate, that nobody else involved in the debate believes such things, something like that. That's there in the early moderns, because they brought in will, and it's there in Nietzsche because he's trying to overturn metaphysics for the sake of belief in the apparent world. And Heidegger is there himself, but he's not there himself based upon a detailed line-by-line critique of what's incoherent in Plotinus or showing that Plotinus really believed what Aristotle thought about time. There is no such proof anywhere in Heidegger, right? It's still entirely possible that all the criticisms of the not in time that Heidegger is laying out here could be true of Plotinus too, and could be true of any Platonic understanding of time that tried to be coherent with the Neoplatonic position. Entirely possible. If that's true, some other Heideggerian has to go show that, because Heidegger hasn't done that. Okay. Why do I bring this up? One of the things that is at stake here is whether or not it is Nietzsche that is suffering from this not in metaphysics that is a misunderstanding of time, or whether or not it is metaphysics tout court all the way back to the early Greeks that is so affected. It matters because a significant portion of Heidegger's belief that metaphysics is something that must be replaced is an inheritance from his agreement with Nietzsche, from Nietzsche's diagnosis of the history of Western metaphysics as the history of nihilism. Heidegger has been an extremely efficient demolisher of that position of Nietzsche, but he still accepts the thrust of that premise, if I can put it that way. Okay. To me, this is like some of the biggest live issues in Heidegger, right? If you're aware of the stakes, right, you have to see that these things are possibilities on the field that are not being always dealt with as thoroughly as the ones that are immediately on the page in front of you. Okay, that's on my own cards on the table about all this. Now I want to summarize what I think Heidegger managed to do in these two chapters. I realize you have a question, James, but I have to get one more point out before we get there. All that said, I think that Heidegger's explication of Nietzsche's metaphysics here is sound. He has given an interpretation of Nietzsche's metaphysics that shows why someone who was the doubting skeptic of human all too human with a semi-positivist phase winds up propounding a weird myth about the eternal return of the same at the peak of his mature philosophy. He shows how that can form the function of releasement or acceptance of fate in Nietzsche's otherwise will to power like subjectivist metaphysics, right? That you would get from a quietist or from a Buddhist, right? Elements of Nietzsche's philosophy that might otherwise jar, people wouldn't know why they're there in the first place, are all tied together here and all make sense together here. So as a feat of interpretation, I think these two lectures are very good, right? He's got Nietzsche. He understands why Nietzsche thought the things he thought, and the way in which those thoughts were motivated by the traditions and problems he had before him, and by the attempted revaluings or re-understandings that Nietzsche was trying to play on the previous parts of the tradition, right? That is what Heidegger is calling thinking here. The ability to understand not just the individual thoughts of the thinker, but why they cohered, what motivated them, how they hang together, how they grew out of the previous problematic in the tradition, how they're the result of wrestling with the same problems that the previous thinkers were wrestling with. You can see into the psychology, the motivations, the thought processes, whatever you want to call it, of Nietzsche, and why these different, perhaps apparently seemingly entirely disparate and crazy aspects of his philosophy all had to be there for the thing to cohere. And that's not easy. It's not easy to come up with an interpretation like that of a philosophy as complicated as Nietzsche, and to do it in 20 pages. And there's an element of this which is a showmanship, hey presto, here's the rabbit out of the hat of, I gave you this big setup of, I'm going to show you how the spirit of revenge and the overcoming the spirit of revenge is for Nietzsche entirely a matter of metaphysics. And by the end of the chapter, it's how Nietzsche did or didn't understand the metaphysics of time that's behind the whole damn thing, right? So that's an impressive feat to me. And as a matter of interpreting Nietzsche deeply and fairly, I think it's impressive. It's impressive on the level of the tree and bloom section, right? And to me, it's also, if I can put it this way, a takedown of Nietzsche, right? He's finding a depth there that others might not see, but it's also finding the coherence that is there because of a set of constraints that Nietzsche has to meet that are I guess the technical term for it would be an example of errancy, right? They're a set of problems that Nietzsche had to solve because they're posed for him by his formulation, understanding of the problem and his predecessors. They might have been a next step in how things had to appear to thinkers wrestling with these things. But there's also a deep incoherence in them. There's also a deep errancy in them. There's we do not have to agree with Nietzsche in them. And back at the earlier sections on Nietzsche, he was setting this problem up as, after you have found Nietzsche, can you be free of him? And this is an example of that. It's assimilating him enough to understand him and pass beyond him. So when this whole first half is trying to show what is thinking, the example of thinking is to grapple with Nietzsche enough to understand not only what he says, but why he's saying it, and to see and to assimilate that enough to be able to pass beyond it, have distance from it, have releasement from it, be able to see it for what it is, for why it happened, but not to be convinced by it, because you can see the elements of it that were forced is the wrong word. Based on assumptions that are questionable and then finally doubtful, as he likes to put it. Okay, pause. It's just an assessment of the chapters, give people a chance to react. James, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, could you go over the how Nietzsche got time wrong, and what is Heidegger's real understanding of time?
Sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, fair question. Okay. The notion of the now that the eternal return is all about is a being as being present. We understand being as present being, not past and not future. The past and the future are in some sense a kind of not really inexistent, not really actual. The really actual is being as being present. And this means that being is understood as being present. Being is a time word, and it designates the present moment of time. When I say moment, I don't mean instant. I mean, like the moment arms of some mobile, right? There's different ways in which the concept is stretched, and the being concept refers to this presentness, present actuality. Okay. So in that sense, there is a notion of being that is being understood upon prior categorizations of time. And that fits with how Heidegger thinks phenomenally we understand being. So that part of being as being present is a narrowing of what being is from Heidegger's point of view, but at least it is one that is projected onto a version of time that is phenomenally experienced, something like that. But what does Nietzsche want to do with his world of becoming that approximates to world of being? He wants to take the notion of the temporal as what passes, as what changes, and by extending it infinitely, make it approximate as closely as possible to a notion of being, whereby being he means eternal and independent of time. So first notion of being is present moment of time. Second notion of being is eternal, independent of time. Between them, from Heidegger's point of view, there's a stark contradiction. What the hell do you mean by being? Do you mean being present? Or do you mean being independent of time? He claims that Nietzsche's eternal return doctrine is founded on the second one, which he's just gotten from the tradition, taken over from the tradition, whereas his actual sense of what now is from the actual now moment of phenomenal time. So from Heidegger's point of view, this is because Nietzsche has simply accepted a Greek and Aristotelian diagnosis of what time is that gave him his being as being present, and all the rest of his jousting with Plato about eternity, right, is happening without ever referring back to that as what time is. It's as though when he's coming up with his notion of the eternal recurrence, it never occurs to Nietzsche to go back to the evidence that made him think of being as being present and examine the phenomena of time itself directly. He's just going to spin it out of his imagination as a version of what becoming could be that would approximate to a notion of being as much as possible and have, useful ethical side effects because it's a value, and he understands all these things as values that are projections for human purposes. So from Heidegger's point of view, he's left the evidence and he's making it up when he's on the eternal return of the same. Why doesn't he go back to understanding the past and the will's relation to the past in terms of the actual phenomena as the past as it phenomenally appears to the will or to the consciousness? I mean, he's not Husserl, but he didn't go there, right? One of the things you could do if you decided that the apparent world is what you should ground yourself in instead of the supposed real world behind the world that you get in the Nietzsche's understanding of Plato is you could say, all right, let's not go with Plato's imaginary world of the ideas behind the world. Let's go to the actual phenomenal evidence of what appears. Nietzsche flies that flag, but he doesn't do it. He doesn't go become a phenomenologist and ground himself in the appearances. He just flies the flag of appearance, yay, right? And that's not the same thing. So from Heidegger's point of view, this means he's trying to invert the value system of Platonism to make appearance be more important than being, while he's leaving the structure there, and his notion of eternity is taken straight from Plato. And from Heidegger's point of view, that means the last analysis, his fundamental, structure is Platonic and metaphysical. Does that help?
So for Heidegger, the being of time is the present, and there is no eternity. Or
For Heidegger,
is there an implication of eternity?
For Heidegger, being is always already understood on the horizon of time. We understand time in terms of our own most possibilities. We think of the past as a memory mediated and presenting of a having business, and our future possibilities as the horizon on which we understand our future. We understand our future not as infinite, but as finite and being towards death and going to close. And the whole temporal structure is to its fundament, riddled with finitude. We know we're going to die, right? And the finite time that we are given is a element of phenomenal time that is the basis of lots of human angst, but anything which isn't facing that angst authentically is just fleeing from it. And from his point of view, your eternal returns of your sames and your eternities are flights from death. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sort of. Thank you. Yeah. I kind of had an impression that for Heidegger, there is some sense of some experience of something beyond,
There is an experience of the appearing of being, but the note in the appearing of being is not that the thing appearing to you is eternal, but that it's actual and the root and behind the rift. So there is a notion of the differentiated meta, if you like, but the being that can be experienced never tells you it's eternal.
It's not eternal. But he does make a distinction between small b being and
Yes,
capitalized being, right? So I'm trying to
absolutely,
what that
absolutely.
capital being, what that is. How's that
So
distinguished?
I want to distinguish the being and the time and the going for a second, right? The other way to think about this is in the metaphysical Aristotelian understanding, right? The beings are supposedly what lasts and are eternal, but the time is what flows. Time is what passes. Time goes away, and the beings as the essences are the things that we can project as being the lasting or eternal behind the flux of events. Heidegger considers this a falsification of the evidence. The beings come and go. Time doesn't. It's always there. Being is always there. Being with a capital B. Time is always there. They're invariants of Dasein's world. What comes and goes are the beings. That's what's temporal. And us, right? So to the extent that you're following the evidence of the being capital B, and time, right? They are structural invariants of our experience. In that sense, you can call them, they're not temporal. They exist and they are if Dasein is, right? They are coextensive with Dasein, right? And that's always the word he uses, and he never says eternal, except to criticize it. He's trying to ground all these things less in how permanent they are, and instead in how actual they are, right? He wants to ground it in actual experience. And that's what being has, right? It's not made up. It's not a fiction. It's not a projection. It actually occurs. It actually has unveilings to man, unveilings to Dasein, and those have a history, right? And you can look for the invariant structures and all of that, and that is, you know, if you like, a kind of substitute for the search for the eternal, or for the search for nature, but it's not searched for as eternal. It's searched for as existent and coextensive with Dasein, coextensive with our existence. I don't know if that helps, but these are great questions. But
Is there a kind of a duration or endurance of that being?
there is the history of the unveiling of the truth of being, which is something like the whole career of especially the West, but of human history more generally. And there is our, you know, role or place in that, and our authentic role or place in that, and how we can participate in that. He never appeals to anything beyond that. Pete, were you trying to talk with the unmute, or?
Thank you.
Yeah, so Heidegger, everything comes from the event. Beings come out of the event. And so in our cosmological terms, we physicists are now in the world of space-time. We have the block universe. We have the Cartesian coordinates that are changed by gravity, but time was something happening in there. But Heidegger says, no, we're in time space, where space comes out of events. And connecting it with Nietzsche, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is a steady state universe, and Heidegger's is a universe of the Big Bang, of finitude, that there's a beginning event, and everything ever since has been events out of which we get meaningful beings. And being with a capital B is that structure in which that makes possible beings in time.
Mostly, I agree. I don't think it's quite as cosmological as that. I mean, that there you can have a cosmological reading of some of it, but being has a history. There was a time before human beings experienced being as being. Being's kind of a discovery of the Greeks. The event is not a discovery of the Greeks, but the interpretation of the meaning of being as an interpretation of the event is way more specific in time for Heidegger. Heidegger, one way to understand Aristotle is that he wanted the material particulars to be more real than the ideal of things which he thought of as abstractions. One way to think about Heidegger is that Aristotle's material particulars are way too general for him, and there's one thing happening once. Not the individual, right? The authentic and the individual, the one time, one thing, once, is the real. Not even the real, it's the actual, is the right word for it. It's the event, right? And the importance that things have does not stem from their generality or their eternity, but from their actuality and their authenticness, right? Nothing needs to happen more than once to be actual. And the actual is the true in that sense. So to the extent that he is concerned with truth, man is the place or site where truth happens, bearing witness to truth, right? The truth that he is trying to bear witness to is an individual occurrence. That's why he likes the term the event, right? It's not a class of events, right? You don't live a class of lives. You live your one life once. Does that help? This is very useful because we're going farther afield to sort of general things of philosophy. James, thumbs up. Okay. I've actually covered most of the stuff I wanted. I managed to get to some of the things I wanted to mention about the history of some of these things. I want to come back to the assessment of Nietzsche. We talked a little bit about some of the things of Neoplatonism and different ideas of eternity and so forth. We talked about the interpretation effect. I'm going to come back to saving man's essential nature in a second, but has Nietzsche succeeded in rescuing man from the spirit of revenge in Heidegger's view, rather than Nietzsche's own? I put it to you that he is not, according to Heidegger's assessment here. There are places where he sort of intimates that. It's a place where he says, is this ending the devastation, or rather the devastation itself? Right. Okay. This is on beginning of the summary transition of part 9. So on page 97. Whether this highest hope which Nietzsche is thinking still leaves room for hope, or whether it does not, on the contrary, carry within itself the real devastation, is something we cannot make out as long as we fail to risk crossing over the bridge with Nietzsche. Right? Fine. Wonderful equivocation there at the end of first you have to understand him, but I think there's no question of where he is on the second of those. Nietzsche's formula for delivering man from revenge is, for Heidegger, something which carries within itself the real devastation. We know what he means by the devastation elsewhere. It means oblivion of being. It means forgetting being. It means not paying attention to, not holding oneself open to what is. This goes back to the 89 and saving power. The point that I'm making is that there, in the whole chapter, we cannot, not chapter, pair of chapters, we have to bear in mind the ways in which this is a criticism of Nietzsche, not just from the standpoint of the coherence of his metaphysics or whether or not he got his logical categories in the right place, but a critique of Nietzsche on the, if I can put it this way, the same sort of spiritual level that's underneath the psychology and the morality he talked back at the beginning of the whole section. This is not an endorsement of Nietzsche. What does he see as necessary instead? Something like a changed essential relationship to being itself that is holding ourselves open to being as much as we can. Why is that something that Nietzsche has fallen down on from Heidegger's point of view? Because he's willing to make conscious myths. He's going to dictate what should be to being. And he's going to make it up, not listen. He's going to make it up as what it should be in order for it to be affirmed or be life affirming. And from Heidegger's point of view, that's the irony in Nietzsche. His criticism of the supposed nihilism in Plato is that he, instead of living in the real world, wanted to make up a world he would be willing to live in. And then Nietzsche goes ahead and does exactly that. Now, I'm not as anti-Platonist as Heidegger might be, and I'll say there's an element of projection of that in Nietzsche. He's criticizing Plato for something that he himself is engaged in terms of willfully falsifying what is in order to make it a world in which he'd be more willing to live, while justifying that as what people always do, right? Okay. So I thought that had to be said because there's, it's easy with someone spends a whole first half of a book giving long, impassioned, expositions of Nietzsche. You can think that, this shows that he agrees with Nietzsche. No. On the specific issue of resentment, he brings this up as well, or not resentment, revenge. Is Nietzsche's work? Yes, Heidegger is correct to try to point out to his contemporaries that there's an element of Nietzsche which desires deliverance from revenge, that is trying to find the still quiet worlds, that is trying to reconcile itself to the yes of existence and overcome the pessimism of Schopenhauer. And if we lose sight of that, we lose sight of Nietzsche. We lose sight of his humanity and his the better parts of Nietzsche, so to speak. But Nietzsche is definitely not free of the spirit of revenge. You can go read the Genealogy of Morals, you can read Twilight of the Idols, you can read the Antichrist if you doubt it. You can read even Nietzsche contra Wagner, right? There's plenty of spirit of revenge in Nietzsche. And one sometimes gets the sense that he thinks if only he were sufficiently revenged upon all the previous teachers' revenge itself would die, right? And this obviously doesn't work. Okay. And Heidegger, lets that out in places quietly. He doesn't dwell on it. It would be not taking Nietzsche as seriously as deserves to be treated to only dwell on that and not the other aspects. Okay. I want to end with, well, first of all, any comments on that, on the assessment of Nietzsche here? I mean, I don't think it's that controversial, but does anyone see Heidegger as being closer to Nietzsche's own position here than I'm laying on?
Well, I think where they agree is, so Nietzsche's trying to overcome the will to power as the answer for everything. And Heidegger would also move in the same direction of saying, yeah, there has to be something besides the will to power. And Nietzsche comes up with the eternal recurrence of the same, and he said, okay, well, that's wrong. Heidegger says,
I understand.
well, that's wrong.
I understand what you're saying, but I mean, let's take, how much is Nietzsche trying to overcome the will to power, right? He certainly sees will to power as the essential character of what is, and he certainly sees the eternal return as a way of reconciling oneself to fate and so and that sort of thing, and a deliverance from the spirit of revenge. But is it a deliverance from the will to power? Not simply. The Schopenhauer he came from was someone who was so concerned with deliverance from will because he thought that specific will was evil, right? He thought that will as will to power was always self-preference, was always evil, and morally did not deserve to be, even if it was the basis of all life drive. That's the kind of pessimism you got in Schopenhauer. Nietzsche is not that. Nietzsche is trying to rehabilitate all that, and not just to get away. He is trying to get away from that pessimism, but he's trying to get away from that pessimism without giving up the fact that will is always something fundamentally selfishly directed in some sense, as alive. And I want to finish, right? Part of what Nietzsche is doing when he says he wants to be delivered from the spirit of revenge to the spirit of punishment is trying to ensure that the will to power is not punished as too selfish, right? There's a line in Gay Science where he says, "What is the seal of liberation? No longer being ashamed in front of yourself," right? So the seal of liberation and being what you are and affirming life means including accepting your evil side to Nietzsche as something which is, right? And Nietzsche is not a moralizer in the sense of that he's going to embrace a doctrine of salvation which cures us of what is evil in will to power by curing it of being will to power. No. He's going to make the will to power not be about punishment and not be about resentment and maybe not be about worldly things so much, and maybe even be a selflessly teaching and leading other wills as a more refined form of will to power. But he is not trying to deliver us from will to power because will to power is Machiavellian and is evil and he's against it. Nothing like it. Right? We can't whitewash Nietzsche so much that the Nietzsche drops out. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. So okay, fair enough. And I'd say the other resonance related would be Nietzsche by embracing fate, amor fati, has a resonance with Heidegger embracing releasement.
Yes.
So
yes, and with a almost a Buddhist renunciation of will that you get in Schopenhauer, right? There's an element of all of those things which has this the typical formula of transcendence, if I want to put it that way, right? He's not simply the mature Nietzsche is not simply reconciled to being only one little self-preferring will, right? It has to be a world-affirming will. And world affirming is not simply self-affirming, it's that as well. There's an element of this which is responding to, if I can put it this way, the formula for despair that you get in Kierkegaard, right? He has to be reconciled to the being in which he is embedded, right? And that means there has to be a gratitude at bottom and not a war with being at bottom for Nietzsche. So absolutely, that is there, and Heidegger is right to point that out as the element in Nietzsche that is, why he's a spiritual person and not a power politician. Put it that way. And you're right that Heidegger doesn't disagree with that at all, right? That's part of his, if I can put it this way, general something like a
disposition.
Well, it's a disposition. It's a proper thinking attitude towards being as being necessary, if not sufficient, for saving man's essential nature, something like that. And there's an element of that which is a kind of piety of thought, and the piety is very downplayed in Nietzsche, but Heidegger is always finding that it's still there, as a nose for it. Okay, so that's just assessments of Nietzsche. I want to do a little bit about transition to the next, having shown that, right, he closes with this discussion of Aristotle as saying that it's hard for us to see the being of beings, right? It's hard for us to see what is most apparent, right? This is starting to transition us to the second half. But the other thing I wanted to point out, this going to be partly transition to the second half, is the point what he made about meta. And I think that Dan brought this up, that there's this element of Greek thought, which is simply seeing the difference between the, I can put it this way, the permanent metaphysical structures as opposed to the beings. Right. There's an element of that which is metaphysics in the broadest sense, and Heidegger is going to rehabilitate it, so to speak. That was not a mistake. If Nietzsche thought that was a mistake because it was putting something behind the apparent, it's not a mistake to Heidegger, and we're going to see that toward the end when we get to Parmenides, when we're going to bring up the, we're going to go back to the pre-Socratics by the time we're done with this book, is the point I'm trying to make. And we're going back to the pre-Socratics, not because the pre-Socratics were where some critical wrong turn was made, but because this thought, which he called the fundamental simple thought of the Greeks, is something he wants to reintroduce us to as something to start over from, right? Which wasn't wrong. Okay. Okay. I've gotten through the things that I wanted to lay out as what I think are essential in this section. I want to give people a chance to ask me detailed questions about things in it before I just briefly sketch what we're going to talk about next time. But I realize we're also a bit into time. We're at 3 hours and a quarter. So if people can be fast about it, does anyone have a particular section or a particular concept that we didn't cover that they need us to go over? A passage that stumped them? It's usually other Jim who has a long list of these, but if he's not here, we might be spared this half hour. Okay. If not, for next time, we're going to be doing part 2, sections 1 to 5. And this starts off with like a complete change of pace. It's left Nietzsche behind. We're now going to be focusing on the title of the book, What is Called Thinking, and the different senses you can put on that statement, right? And that's going to be, what do we call thinking in the sense of what is designated by the term, but also what calls for thinking, where calls is being used in an entirely different sense than to denote. But instead, something we are called upon to do, or a calling, and bringing out those multiplicity of possible meanings of the title of the book is going to be the intro to part 2. And this is going to take us a little bit afield to speech, logic, logos, terms, difference between terms and the things they designate, that sort of stuff. That's sort of problematic. And then logos is going to be the word that introduces us back to the early Greeks. By the end of it, we'll have brought up the core little pre-Socratic fragment that we want to investigate for the rest of the book, which is from Parmenides, and it's the statement that being and thinking are the same. That's the usual translation, at least, which has multiple terms in it: being, thinking, same. Same is not just an equal sign, it's another term of art. So when you're keeping track of it, remember that there's 3 things being talked about there. And the same is one of them. Okay. Some of this section has, comments that I would say are contextual to his time. They're digs at, logical positivism kind of things. That's still around enough that maybe the digs are still contemporary. I don't know. And there'll also be a discussion of thinking and thanking. So some of the typical late Heideggerian etymological readings, if I can put it that way, in the German as opposed to the Greek, will be here. I still consider much of this early section to be transitional, right? It is useful that he introduces all of these things about what calls for thinking and thinking is thinking before we get to the Parmenides. But to me, the meat is often the getting of the Parmenides. But for people who've never seen those other aspects of Heidegger, maybe important aspects of his later as opposed to earlier philosophy, it's not the same manner of these things that you'll find in Being and Time, for example. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the material for next time is less weighty than the material we did this last time, and it's going to get weightier again when we get back into the pre-Socratics and the Parmenides fragment. James, question or comment?
Oh, in his discussion of Parmenides, is he going to kind of like that lead us into understanding what he means by B with a capital B?
What Parmenides means by being or understands by being, and also how it's related to thinking, is definitely going to be the subject matter. So absolutely. He's going to give a detailed and in some places forced interpretation of a fragment like 7 words long, and he's going to give you 6 different readings of 3 out of 4 of 3 out of 7 of the words or something like that. So you will not lack for detail by the end of the book. But we're not going to get into all that detail on the Parmenides saying next time, because it's only going to be introduced at the end of our reading. But the following 2 readings will be all about taking apart the Parmenides saying in detail. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to the interesting discussion on the one, if there is a one.
Well, we're not going to get all of the all of the Parmenides on the one here. this is going to be about a single saying of his of being and thinking of the same. Is that same related to one, and in what ways? Honestly, Heidegger is not going to be, I wanted to say it's not going to be your best guide to that. I don't know if he's your best guide. It's not going to be the subject matter. It's not going to be the main theme. There's plenty of older thought on that, and some of the stuff we did in Being and Some Philosophers was about that. I don't know, over a year and a half ago now. But the notion of the one is not the main notion being tackled here. Being is and thinking is. I don't know if that helps.
Would you consider that Heidegger, is he going to be interested in metaphysics? Because he did write a book on the introduction to metaphysics. What do you think?
Yes, he's certainly going to be interested in metaphysics here as well, but he's the reason this isn't an introduction to metaphysics part 2, but is what is called thinking, is because he thinks that thinking is something that can get us beyond the metaphysical perspective alone. So it starts from the understanding metaphysics, but it's meant to be something that can be more conscious of what's going on in metaphysics than metaphysics itself perhaps was. That'd be one way of trying to formulate it. He thinks of thinking as the next thing to do. Much of the subject matter will be shared with metaphysics, but thinking is a different way of doing it than metaphysics is, if that's in his terms of art. That doesn't mean the subject matter isn't something that would be in a metaphysics class at a university. It is. But that's because the universities don't always keep up with the latest movements in philosophy and don't rename their departments for things which are only 100 years old. Dan?
Yeah, one more thing, like going back to Nietzsche and thinking, like reading, for example, Ecce Homo, you realize that Nietzsche he didn't care much to solve problems, but he was quite dedicated to thinking. Like he wanted to create problems. He was kind of like almost like an evil spirit, playful and doing all kind of trying to create trouble and to take things down. But I don't think he was into fixing problems. But he was more like to create problems. But I think he was dedicated to thinking in this respect. And I think every time when like here, when Heidegger points out that he's going and he's pointing towards something, he's sometimes pointing beyond metaphysics. He was in metaphysics, taking things down, but he was also pointing things beyond metaphysics, like to some kind of a surprising solution. So I think, again, Nietzsche was dedicated to thinking, but not to fixing problems, to me.
So I agree with you that he was intellectually alive, very intellectually independent, and he was fiercely concerned with his independence and intellectual liveliness, and with his skeptic's doubt as asset on previous things. I do think that there were problems he was trying to solve, and I think that the Western civilization becoming mired in something like nihilism was one of those problems that he thought he was addressing, if not solving. You're right that he was also a playful spirit and a tempter, and like that sort of aspect of trying to enliven the intellects of the people who read him, especially the younger set, so in that sense, provoking. But I think that he did expect, perhaps unrealistically, some positive results in the direction of overcoming of what he took to be nihilism from what he was doing. He also thought that process would be messy, long, and not entirely peaceful, right? That's why he writes things like "Why I Am Dynamite," right? He did not expect that this is going to be an easy process by any stretch of the imagination. But Jason.
Yeah, I was always wondering about how Heidegger actually often criticizes his own work as he's progressing through the different types of problems he's working on. Because during Being and Time, he's thinking in terms of the meaning of being is what you're doing with your time. But then in other books, he kind of criticizes that idea that whatever you're doing is meaningful. So I don't know if that comes up with thinking. Is thinking supposed to be one of the final solutions he has for this problem of meaning? Or is it just another step that he's trying to deliver for us to work on?
Okay, so fair questions. I mean, some of this is about problematic of being in time specifically. Does his thought evolve? Yes, absolutely. But some of it is differences in subject matter. Being in time is meant to try to expose and explore the structures of the everyday consciousness, of everyday life, right? And he's not primarily talking about everyday life here, or let alone things which are meant to be true for almost everyone, almost all the time, kind of things, right? Part of why he was doing that in being in time was that he was trying to establish that such structures exist for the neo-Kantians around him who could understand arguments like that, but were not necessarily otherwise open to the whole direction he was going or likely to go. The thinking he's talking about here is primarily about a kind of engagement with the history of thought as a kind of unfolding story of how man has interacted with being and tried to understand being. And is part of that meaning making? Sure, but not in the my individual life meaning making tactical sense, if I can put it that way, right? He's trying to pull out to the broad sweep of the history. He thinks that the relationship that man has had to being is something that has a history, and he's trying to explain that history, explore that history, and he's inviting people to participate in that history as something that they can do if they think. And that is meant to be something that is more meaningful to spend his time on than making shoes, right? It's not because there isn't a relationship to being and making shoes. There is, or there's meaning in making shoes if you try to do it well, but because the history of the truth of being is to Heidegger history with a capital H that deserves the name, and thinking about it as thinking with a capital T that deserves the name. And all of this is part of his kind of calling we'll get to in the second half of the book, where the calling is to, well, what he was talking about this previous time, hold oneself open to being as far as one can. So anyway, there's a kind of, he's not simply going through and criticizing the previous stuff. Some of that was emphasis, and some of it was, pedagogy of how far along he expected the audience was. He thinks he's more up on the peaks now, right? So he's inviting people to come up to the peaks and see what's up there. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Fair question. Okay. We're at 3.5 hours. I'm inclined to call it. And does anyone have a problem with the timing of first 5 lectures of part 2 by the 20th of August next? Without objection, to so ordered, as they say. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, especially newcomers. All the questions were great. Love the feedback and how constructive it is, and contributions for everybody. Exactly what we like to see. And look forward to seeing you guys next time.